The story of empires is the story of breath. They rise like dawn, glowing with promise. They fall like dusk, fading into silence. Babylon once believed its walls eternal, its markets unbreakable, its rivers unchanging. Yet time moves in cycles, patient as the moon, merciless as the tide. What is built is broken. What is gathered is scattered. What is crowned is always waiting to be unthroned. Prophets once whispered that trade is a thread, binding worlds in fragile knots. When the knot loosens, kingdoms unravel. Today, too, we live by those same threads. Oceans of commerce, rivers of exchange, fragile as silk, strong as fate. The ruins of Babylon do not sleep, they speak. Their silence is warning, their dust is prophecy. And as we listen, we hear the echo of our own age already written in their fall. Babylon's walls were legend. They rose high above the plain, layered in brick and stone, painted with glazed tiles that glimmered like captured sunlight. Travelers approached from distant deserts and believed they saw mountains rising where none should be. The gates, crowned in blue and gold, shimmered with lions, dragons, and bulls, guardians of an empire that declared itself eternal. The people of Babylon walked beneath them with pride, their steps echoing against stone that seemed beyond decay. Yet above those walls, stars still shone, patient, unblinking, eternal. The illusion of permanence was woven into daily life. Merchants in the Great Bazaar told stories of walls so thick chariots raced along their tops. Priests in temples declared the gods themselves had blessed the city's foundations. Mothers reassured children that no enemy could ever breach such stone. Yet illusions are delicate threads, spun from belief, and belief can shatter. For stone, though mighty, does not endure beyond time. The heavens remind us of this truth with every night's return. Within the city, life pulsed like a great river. Caravans poured through the gates, their camels heavy with lapis, tin, cedar, and silk. Markets roared with voices, Akkadian, Aramaic, Greek, Egyptian, each language a tributary flowing into Babylon's wealth. Spices smoked in the air. Silver clinked against bronze. Scribes recorded debts in clay tablets stacked higher than men. The people believed the walls protected not only bodies, but fortune itself. The illusion was complete. Prosperity sheltered by stone. Yet the stars above whispered otherwise. At night, when the markets quieted, astrologers climbed ziggurats to read the skies. They whispered that the walls were nothing compared to constellations that had watched empires rise and vanish before. Orion, Scorpio, Pleiades, they had seen Akkad, Sumer, Assyria, and now Babylon. They saw stone as fragile clay, crowns as fleeting ornaments, and thrones as dust in waiting. The priests who truly listened trembled, but their voices were drowned beneath feasts and festivals. The people preferred illusion to prophecy. Thus the law of illusion declared itself. Walls may rise, but they do not outlast stars. Strength is not in stone, but in time, and time is merciless. Empires that mistake walls for eternity are already writing their epitaphs. Babylon glittered like captured sunlight, but above it, the constellations burned, unchanged, unbroken, eternal. The illusion of invincibility was not only written in stone, it was breathed into rituals. At dawn, the gates of Babylon opened with processions of priests carrying incense, their chants drifting into the air like threads of smoke, binding heaven and earth. Offerings of grain, honey, and wine were laid at temple steps, as if to persuade the gods to watch over the city's walls. The people believed these daily gestures reinforced the stone itself, that prayers were mortar no enemy could pierce. Yet no offering can halt the slow erosion of time. In the streets, musicians played flutes and drums to welcome caravans, their rhythms echoing against glazed walls. Children chased after donkeys laden with goods, laughing in the shadow of towers that seemed to scrape the sky. Traders counted their silver beneath awnings striped with color, secure in the thought that Babylon's gates would always stand. They lived as though the city were a vessel too vast to sink, a vessel guarded not only by stone but by destiny itself. But destiny is never so easily bound. Festivals amplified the illusion. During the New Year rites, the statue of Marduk was carried in procession along avenues lined with flowers and banners. Crowds pressed close to touch the cords of the chariot, believing they touched eternity itself. Kings knelt before the god's image in ritual humility, but the spectacle was one of power, not surrender. The message was clear: as long as Marduk reigned, Babylon reigned, and as long as Babylon reigned, its walls could never fall. Faith and pride merged into one shimmering illusion. Yet even in celebration, doubts lingered. Astrologers peered into skies clouded with omens, eclipses, falling stars, strange alignments. Some whispered of cycles that no wall could halt, the endless turning of empires. These voices were quiet, cautious, for no king welcomed prophecy of decline. But among the learned, the truth was understood. Stone crumbles, crowns tarnish, and no mortal hand can alter the sky's rhythm. Still, the people turned away from such warnings, preferring music, wine, and the illusion of permanence. Inside homes, illusions took gentler form. Families told stories by firelight of heroes who built the city's walls with divine help, of spirits guarding the gates from unseen enemies. Children fell asleep believing the walls themselves could breathe and watch, that lions painted in tiles would leap to life if danger neared. In the hush of night, such tales softened fear and filled dreams with comfort. The city seemed eternal because every generation was taught to believe it so. Illusion became inheritance, passed like heirlooms of the mind. But the stars never lied. They watched silently as feasts roared, as coins clinked, as priests sang, as kings boasted. They watched as illusions grew heavy, fragile, destined to fracture. For stars do not need walls. They endure without stone. They shine upon ruins as they once shone upon glory, unchanging, eternal. And thus Babylon's pride, painted gates, towering walls, bustling markets, was already fading beneath the gaze of constellations. Illusion was crown, but illusion is always brittle. Illusion begins to fracture not with thunder, but with whispers. Merchants in taverns murmured of Persian armies gathering beyond the horizon, of shifting alliances along the rivers. Caravans that once arrived swiftly now faltered, slowed by unrest in distant lands. Prices rose in the marketplace, silver thinned in the purses of traders, and still the people comforted themselves with the same refrain: the walls will protect us. Stone, they believed, was shield against hunger, shield against betrayal, shield against time itself. Yet no wall holds back silence when trade falters. Priests, uneasy, offered more frequent sacrifices. Sheep were slaughtered, incense burned, omens read in smoke and entrails. The signs grew darker, yet proclamations declared them favorable. To admit weakness was unthinkable, for illusion thrives only when doubt is smothered. The city feasted while shadows gathered, its people drinking wine beneath banners that hid the cracks forming beneath their feet. They believed feasts could drown famine, processions could silence prophecy, but the stars whispered otherwise. Common folk too began to feel the weight of uncertainty. Farmers complained of canals silting with neglect, their waters sluggish where once they rushed. Grain yields dipped, storage bins filled more slowly, yet still the illusion persisted, that Babylon was eternal, that nothing could touch its bounty. In hushed conversations at night, mothers worried, traders fretted, soldiers prayed. But when morning came, the rhythm of markets resumed, and illusion resumed with it. Survival often requires belief, even when belief is fragile. In palaces, the kings held fast to grandeur. They summoned architects to repair towers, commanded artisans to lay new tiles upon gates, demanded musicians to play louder in the courts. They mistook brightness for strength, marble for permanence, spectacle for stability. But illusion, however grand, is only curtain. Behind it, treachery simmered. Nobles eyed each other with suspicion, merchants plotted in secret, priests debated the favor of gods. The walls still stood, but within them, unity began to dissolve. And above it all, the stars endured. They glittered cold and indifferent over walls that once gleamed like fire. They had seen Sumer rise, Akkad fall, Assyria conquer, Assyria crumble. They saw Babylon now, proud yet fragile, glowing brightly in its illusion of eternity. And they knew, as they always knew, that stone fades, crowns vanish, and no wall can outlast the stars. The illusion was magnificent, but it was illusion still. Thus the first law closes its lesson. Babylon's walls were not protection but symbols of pride, of belief, of illusion, mistaken for permanence. The people believed in stone, the stars believed in time, and time, patient as ever, would prove the stronger. The Euphrates was Babylon's heartbeat. It flowed wide and slow across the plain, bearing fertile silt to fields, carrying boats heavy with grain, timber, and stone. Along its banks rose gardens, orchards, and villages, each one nourished by the river's patient hand. In summer heat, when desert winds scoured the land, the Euphrates shimmered like a serpent of silver, sustaining life where none should thrive. To the Babylonians, the river was not only resource but deity, flowing strength, eternal abundance, the living vein of empire. Irrigation canals branched from its body like veins from a heart. They carried water into fields where barley bent in golden waves and date palms stood tall, their fruit heavy with sweetness. Farmers sang as they worked, their voices low and rhythmic, blending with the river's murmur. Without Euphrates, no harvest, no markets, no temples, no empire. The people believed as long as water flowed, Babylon's prosperity would never fail. The illusion was sweet, and it endured for centuries. Trade rode upon its current. Flat-bottomed boats glided downriver, piled with goods from distant mountains and valleys. Copper from the east, cedar from Lebanon, wool from pastures, pearls from the Gulf. Markets along the banks swelled with color and fragrance. Baskets of pomegranates, jars of honey, cloth dyed with indigo. Merchants boasted that the Euphrates carried not only wealth, but destiny. Its waters stitched the known world together, binding Babylon at the center. To control the river was to control the flow of fortune. Yet rivers, like empires, are never truly tamed. Floods swept through when rains were heavy, drowning fields and homes alike. In dry seasons, canals shrank, leaving cracked earth and withered crops. Farmers prayed to gods who seemed deaf at times, pouring offerings into waters that ignored them. The river gave, and the river took, reminding all who depended upon it that abundance was never guaranteed. Beneath Babylon's prosperity flowed the truth of fragility. Priests told stories of the river as living being. They said it remembered insults and repaid them, that it carried messages to the underworld, that its waters reflected not only sunlight, but the will of gods. Children were warned never to mock its current, for the river listened. Such stories kept reverence alive, binding awe to necessity. But reverence could not soften disaster. Each time the river betrayed them, illusions cracked, and fear seeped into the city's confidence. Thus, the law of rivers begins its lesson. Wealth flows, but it also fails. Empires that believe rivers' eternal mistake motion for permanence. Babylon built its glory upon Euphrates, believing the waters could never falter. But rivers are restless, changing, shifting. What they give, they take. What they nourish, they erode. The people looked into the flowing silver and saw eternity. The stars, watching above, saw only impermanence. The river was more than a vein of water. It was woven into Babylon's rituals. At dawn, priests filled golden vessels with Euphrates water, carrying them in solemn procession to temples where they were poured over sacred statues. The act was symbolic. The gods themselves were bathed in the river's blessing. At dusk, families left offerings upon its banks: bread, dates, oil, gifts cast into the current as though carried into eternity. Each ritual reinforced the belief that Babylon's destiny was tied to the Euphrates, that as long as it flowed, divine favor endured. Children learned to swim in its slow bends, their laughter rising with the cries of herons. Fishermen cast nets by lantern light, their reflections shimmering upon the dark water. Lovers met at twilight along reed-choked banks, whispering promises under the gaze of moonlit ripples. Daily life was inseparable from the river's rhythm. It was cradle, marketplace, sanctuary. The people believed its current was their protector, wide, generous, and eternal. Yet beneath this devotion was a silence the city ignored. Rivers shift, rivers betray. For the Euphrates was also a hidden danger. Its canals, vital for irrigation, demanded constant labor. Silt thickened year by year, clogging channels, starving fields. When work faltered, harvests declined. When harvests failed, hunger grew teeth. Grain was no longer abundance but scarcity, and scarcity gnawed at empire's pride. Merchants muttered that silver lost meaning when stomachs were empty. Priests prayed louder though the river seemed deaf, and families whispered their unease at night. The water that had once been life began to taste like doubt. Babylon's walls, however high, could not guard against a failing river. Soldiers might repel armies, but no spear could command drought. Festivals might drown anxiety in music, but famine seeped beneath laughter. Even kings, robed in splendor, felt their thrones wobble when the Euphrates faltered. The illusion of permanence weakened each season. Canals went neglected. Beneath painted gates and tiled towers, fragility deepened, though the people still sang hymns of eternity. The river carried those hymns away, as it always carried everything. And still the people clung to faith. Prophets declared that the Euphrates was chosen by the gods to shield Babylon forever. They pointed to floods as signs of cleansing, to droughts as trials meant to test loyalty. Illusion twisted hardship into prophecy, giving pain meaning. But faith did not irrigate canals. Faith did not mend cracks in the system. The river's betrayal was quiet, gradual, but relentless. It whispered in the dry earth, in withered barley, in the silence of empty granaries. The law of rivers sharpened its lesson. What flows may falter, what nourishes may withhold. Babylon's lifeblood was also its weakness, for rivers cannot be possessed. They can only be borrowed. The Euphrates did not belong to Babylon. Babylon belonged to it. And as it flowed, so too the city flourished. As it failed, so too the city faltered. The illusion of eternity dissolved each time the current slowed, each time the fields cracked, each time the people realized that stone walls mean little without flowing water. In the end, it was the river itself that betrayed Babylon. Not the chariots of Persia, not the spears of foreign soldiers, but the waters that had once seemed eternal guardians. Cyrus the Great, patient and cunning, studied the flow of the Euphrates. He saw what the Babylonians refused to see, that the lifeline of the city could be turned into its noose. While Babylon feasted behind its towering walls, Persian engineers cut channels into the plain, diverting the river's flow into marshes and reservoirs. The water sank away, quiet as breath leaving a body. The night came when the riverbed ran low. Babylon's walls still loomed, but their foundations had been robbed of their shield. Where once deep water surged, mud lay exposed, glistening in moonlight. Through that silence, Persian soldiers crept, boots sinking into wet earth, armor muted by night. The gates along the river, left unwatched in arrogance, became open doors. The empire's lifeblood had been hollowed, and in its absence, the city was pierced. Inside the city, the illusion persisted for a few hours longer. Candles burned in feasting halls, music swelled with drums and lyres, wine spilled into cups. Merchants boasted of caravans to come. Priests reassured crowds that Marduk's blessing endured. Yet even as laughter echoed against painted walls, shadows spread along the riverbanks. By dawn, the Persians were inside. Babylon, once called eternal, lay in silence broken only by the shuffle of foreign boots. The Euphrates had carried its empire into glory, and then carried it into ruin. The lesson was bitter yet clear. Rivers give life, but rivers also deliver death. They are not loyal. They flow where they are led, whether into fields of grain or into the hands of enemies. Babylon believed itself protected by water, but water cannot be bound by walls, nor bribed by gold, nor persuaded by prayer. The river answered only to gravity, to time, to the laws of nature no king could command. And so the law of rivers closed its judgment. Wealth flows, wealth fails. Prosperity is never permanent when it rides upon currents that shift with every season, every flood, every drought. Babylon's pride had mistaken motion for eternity, but eternity belongs only to the stars. The Euphrates flowed before Babylon. It flows after Babylon. The empire was only a moment in its passage, a brief reflection upon its waters, already fading into memory as the current carried on. The heart of Babylon was not only its throne room, not only its temples rising in tiers of brick and gold. The true throne lay in its markets. There, beneath awnings striped in red and green, wealth pulsed like blood through the body of empire. To walk the bazaar was to see kingdoms converge, caravans unloading cedar from distant mountains, jars of frankincense heavy with fragrance, bolts of silk shimmering like captured rainbows. Merchants shouted prices in a dozen tongues, their words overlapping like waves upon a shore. Every sense was stirred. The air carried smoke from cooking fires, the sweetness of honey, the sharpness of pepper. Donkeys brayed under heavy loads, camels groaned, their saddles creaking. Crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, bargaining with gestures as much as words. A farmer from the plains might trade grain for wool, a priest might purchase incense for temple rites. Each exchange was not mere commerce, it was ceremony, binding Babylon to lands far beyond its gates. Coins and tablets recorded these flows. Silver stamped with royal seals changed hands swiftly, clinking like raindrops upon stone. Clay tablets, pressed with cuneiform wedges, bore records of debts, contracts, and promises. Scribes sat cross-legged at the edges of stalls, their styluses tapping rhythm into wet clay, as if time itself were being captured in writing. These tablets outlasted men, carrying the pulse of trade into memory. In Babylon, market stalls were archives, and merchants were scribes of empire. But beneath abundance pulsed fragility. The same currents that fed Babylon's greatness could turn swiftly against it. A single drought in distant valleys meant fewer caravans. A war along trade routes sent prices soaring, merchants whispering unease into crowded taverns. Wealth that seemed eternal proved delicate, dependent on roads that stretched thin across deserts, on treaties that shifted like sand, on alliances that cracked under greed. Thrones of markets gleamed, but they stood on uncertain ground. Still, the people believed. To walk the bazaar was to feel Babylon's invincibility. They saw spices that had traveled 1,000 miles, gemstones that glowed with foreign suns, horses whose muscles rippled with untamed strength. They believed their city was the center of the world, its markets endless, its wealth eternal. The illusion of walls was matched by the illusion of markets, that abundance could never falter, that exchange itself was throne and crown. Yet the stars above, as always, whispered otherwise. In Babylon, trade was not simply necessity, it was myth. Stories spread of merchants guided by the gods across deserts, caravans protected by divine beasts, fortunes granted by celestial favor. Every coin was believed to carry more than silver. It carried destiny. To spend was to participate in a cosmic drama, where wealth linked mortals to divine order. Markets became sacred space as much as economic one, places where gods and men shared in the act of exchange. Priests themselves walked among the stalls. They purchased incense to burn before Marduk, sacred oils to anoint statues, precious woods to craft temple doors. Their presence sanctified commerce, wrapping trade in ritual. Bargaining was not only negotiation of price, but negotiation of fate. A fair deal was seen as harmony, deceit was blasphemy. Yet deceit still crept in, weights adjusted, silver clipped, promises broken. Markets were thrones, but they were also battlegrounds of trust. The psychology of wealth unfolded here. Farmers who sold grain felt pride not merely in coin, but in recognition that their labor nourished empire. Merchants returning from journeys were greeted like heroes, their goods proof of courage and endurance. Children watching the bustle learned early that prosperity was power, that silver spoke louder than stone. The market was classroom as much as throne, teaching generations that survival depended not on walls or kings, but on the delicate flow of trade. But thrones built upon exchange also demanded obedience. Prices rose, and with them tempers. Debts mounted, carved into clay tablets that endured longer than flesh. A man could die, but his obligation remained, binding his children to payment. The law of exchange was merciless. What is promised must be delivered even if generations carried the weight. Thus, markets held more power than palaces, for palaces demanded loyalty, but markets demanded life. The fragility of empire echoed here too. When caravans slowed, rumors multiplied. A shortage of copper meant whispers of war in the east. Fewer spices meant raiders stalked the deserts. Markets breathed unease as swiftly as prosperity. Fear traveled faster than camels, spreading like smoke between stalls. Empires that relied on trade discovered their greatest thrones were also their greatest chains. Exchange could exalt, but exchange could also strangle. Yet still, the markets glowed. Lanterns lit the stalls at dusk, flames dancing upon copper vessels and silver coins. Music rose with bargaining, laughter mingled with shouts, and the city pulsed with illusion once more. That prosperity was endless, that wealth was eternal, that markets were thrones stronger than walls. But illusions, however bright, are always fragile. The coins clinked, the scribes pressed tablets, the stars glittered above, and time waited, as it always waits, to shatter what men mistake for permanence. The throne of markets gleamed, but it carried seeds of ruin. Greed spread like ivy through Babylon's stalls. Merchants began hoarding goods, raising prices to squeeze desperate buyers. Silver no longer flowed as freely, its weight growing heavier with each transaction. Inequality widened, the poor crushed by debts written on tablets harder than stone. Markets that once united the city began to divide it, turning stalls into battlegrounds of resentment. The throne of exchange revealed itself not as crown, but as chain. The illusions of abundance grew brittle. When caravans faltered, markets emptied and desperation seeped into every street. Families sold heirlooms to buy grain. Nobles squeezed peasants for tribute, and creditors pressed claims with merciless hands. The very system that had made Babylon glorious became the yoke upon its people. Wealth was no longer lifeblood but poison, circulating unevenly, suffocating those without power. The throne of exchange turned tyrant, indifferent to the cries of its subjects. Priests, sensing unrest, declared that the gods were displeased. They demanded larger offerings, finer incense, richer tribute. But faith could not fill empty granaries. The people, once soothed by ritual, grew weary of sacrifice without return. Whispers rose in taverns. Perhaps the gods had abandoned Babylon. Perhaps the markets, once sacred, were corrupted beyond repair. Illusion unraveled thread by thread, and beneath it lay fear. Fear that the city's prosperity was neither eternal nor protected. Inevitably, betrayal followed. Merchants once loyal to the city began to sell secrets to foreigners, shifting alliances to preserve their fortunes. Nobles schemed for advantage, choosing silver over loyalty. Even soldiers, their wages delayed, muttered in discontent. The throne of exchange could not inspire unity. It could only command obedience through debt. And debt, unlike faith, breeds only bitterness. Babylon's power slipped, not with collapse of walls, but with collapse of trust in the markets that had sustained it. Thus, the law of exchange delivered its judgment. Markets are thrones, but thrones are fragile. They rule through illusion, through wealth flowing like river water, but when the river dries, the throne crumbles. Babylon believed its markets eternal, yet silver corrodes, contracts fail, and greed corrodes faster than stone. The stalls once filled with spices and silk became symbols of fragility, proof that empires cannot live by commerce alone. Walls may fall to armies, but markets fall to shadows within. And so Babylon stood, proud and gilded, yet hollowed by its own abundance. The coins still clinked, the scribes still pressed tablets, but beneath the noise was silence, the silence of inevitability. Exchange, once throne, had become executioner. The city walked its streets believing in eternity, while the stars above glittered with quiet certainty. No throne endures forever, not even one built upon markets. Abundance first appears as gift. Babylon, fed by fertile fields and enriched by endless caravans, swelled with treasures beyond counting. Granaries overflowed, temples shone with gold, and nobles reclined on couches inlaid with ivory. Wine flowed in bronze cups, oil burned in lamps that turned night into perpetual day. The people believed their wealth proof of divine favor, each feast a covenant with eternity. Yet abundance, like the river in flood, is never still. What begins as gift soon swells into burden. Feasts became the city's heartbeat. Kings summoned nobles to banquets where roasted lambs were piled high, where musicians played until dawn, where dancers spun in glittering garments. Perfume hung thick in the air, mingling with the sweetness of honeyed figs and the sharpness of pomegranate wine. Guests laughed until their voices cracked, convinced that such plenty could never fade. In those halls, illusion hardened into conviction. Babylon was eternal, because it was full. But excess distorts balance. The poor who once shared in markets and festivals found themselves excluded from the abundance of nobles. Bread grew scarce for common families, while banquets roared louder than ever. Silver that might have repaired canals was poured into goblets. Grain that might have filled empty bellies fattened animals for feasts. Abundance became mirror, reflecting inequality more sharply than any law. For every table heavy with food, there were homes where children whispered themselves to sleep with hunger. Priests warned against this imbalance. They spoke of ancient floods, sent as punishment for arrogance, of gods who withdrew blessings when men forgot humility. Their voices were faint against the music of feasts. The people preferred the rhythm of drums to the rhythm of prophecy. To question abundance was to question eternity, and eternity was fragile when tested. And so the feasts grew larger, louder, more extravagant, illusions woven into every cup, every song, every golden plate. The law of excess whispered its warning even then, for what grows too full cannot endure. A river too swollen bursts its banks, drowning fields it once nourished. A city too glutted forgets the fragility beneath its splendor. Babylon mistook fullness for permanence, mistook feasts for foundation. Yet in the silence beyond music, in the hunger beyond walls, time prepared its judgment. For abundance is never only blessing, it is burden waiting to break. The palaces of Babylon became theaters of excess. Their walls were painted with lapis skies and golden suns, their columns wrapped in cedar and bronze. Courtyards overflowed with fountains, their waters spiced with rose petals. Servants scattered reeds upon floors so guests might walk in comfort, their sandals sinking into fragrant mats. At banquets, gold plates gleamed so brightly they reflected torchlight like captive stars. In these palaces, kings displayed power not through armies but through abundance. The message was clear. Babylon could never fall, for its treasures were endless. Yet such displays carried their own poison. Nobles competed to host feasts grander than kings, measuring prestige not in wisdom or loyalty, but in extravagance. One family slaughtered dozens of oxen for a single evening. Another lined its hall with silver lamps burning imported oil. Competition bred arrogance, arrogance bred division. The city's strength, once unity in trade and ritual, fractured into rivalries of indulgence. Abundance became weapon, each noble flaunting wealth as though it was shield against fate. Rituals themselves began to blur into indulgence. Processions once sacred to Marduk became excuses for spectacle. Priests demanded more incense, rarer oils, richer fabrics to clothe statues. Sacred chants were drowned by musicians, solemn prayers replaced with revelry. The line between worship and indulgence thinned, until even offerings to the gods seemed less devotion than performance. The people watched and wondered if blessings were still earned, or if they were being purchased, and whether gods could be bribed forever. Inequality deepened like a crack in stone. While nobles filled their halls with imported wines, common families struggled for bread. Debt chains tightened, binding farmers to markets they could no longer afford. Hunger whispered in alleys while feasts thundered in palaces. Children gazed at towers glowing with torchlight, their bellies hollow, their eyes wide with silent accusation. Excess, once celebrated as proof of empire's greatness, revealed itself as fracture. The city glittered, but beneath the glow lay shadow. Psychologically, abundance dulled vigilance. When feasts never ended, who feared famine? When silver never ceased clinking, who prepared for scarcity? Kings intoxicated by splendor dismissed omens of decline. Nobles believed their banquets could outlast storms. The people clung to illusion, for illusion was softer than truth. Yet within them stirred unease, a quiet recognition that fullness cannot last. Even the richest goblet empties, even the brightest flame gutters. In every hall, beneath every song, time whispered its reminder. Thus, the law of excess deepened its warning. Abundance blinds, and blindness invites ruin. Babylon's treasures meant to strengthen became burden. Feasts dulled vigilance, wealth widened divisions, rituals decayed into spectacle. The people sang, drank, and celebrated beneath towers that already trembled. The city mistook splendor for permanence, but permanence belongs only to silence, and silence was already gathering at the edges of Babylon's feasts, waiting for music to fade. Excess, when carried too far, turns from shield to snare. In Babylon's last years, the banquets grew louder even as granaries shrank. Wine poured in greater rivers, though harvests faltered. Gold gleamed brighter in palaces, though canals lay clogged with silt. The city consumed itself in spectacle, masking cracks with silk and incense. Nobles assured the people that abundance proved favor, but abundance had already become weight, bending the empire beneath its own treasures. Feasts that once symbolized unity turned hollow. Guests reclined on couches, laughing, but the laughter was brittle, forced, haunted by rumors of Persian armies gathering beyond the horizon. Music played, but beneath it thrummed unease. Even kings, surrounded by singers and torchlight, felt shadows pressing in. The more fragile the city became, the more extravagance was demanded, as if louder celebration might silence prophecy. Yet no amount of wine can drown the truth. Treasures themselves became chains. Gold hoarded in temples drew the envy of enemies. Silver, once lifeblood of markets, now corrupted loyalty, bribing soldiers, fracturing nobles. Jewels glittered in crowns, but crowns weighed heavily when hunger rose. Wealth that had once exalted Babylon now suffocated it, binding rulers to illusions they no longer believed. To abandon splendor was unthinkable. To sustain it was impossible. The burden of abundance became unbearable. And so, when Persians came, Babylon was not a city ready for defense, but a banquet waiting for silence. Its people had been trained to feast, not to fight. Its nobles to flaunt, not to endure. The enemy diverted rivers, crept beneath walls, and the city fell as quietly as a cup overturned. Feasts ended not with music but with silence, palaces abandoned, treasures looted. Abundance, mistaken for eternity, had hastened collapse. Thus the law of excess delivered its final truth. What is too full cannot last. Babylon's glory became burden, its wealth became weakness, its feasts became epitaphs. Abundance had blinded, divided, and betrayed. The city that believed itself eternal discovered the simplest law of all. Nothing glitters forever beneath the indifferent stars. Fear does not always come with trumpet or drum. Sometimes it drifts in quietly, carried by rumor, whispered in taverns, murmured in markets. In Babylon, fear came as stories of Persians rising beyond the eastern horizon, stories of swift armies, disciplined ranks, cunning kings. At first these tales were dismissed as exaggerations, for what empire could rival Babylon's walls, its markets, its wealth? But repetition is a slow poison. Each telling etched unease deeper, until even laughter carried a tremor. Merchants were the first to sense the weight of danger. Caravans that once flowed freely along distant routes grew hesitant. Traders spoke of Persian patrols along roads once safe, of tolls demanded, of sudden disappearances. Goods arrived later, scarcer, costlier. The bazaar, once overflowing, began to pulse with anxiety. Markets remember fear quickly, for trade survives only in trust, and when trust falters, prosperity trembles. Babylon's abundance dimmed, its pulse quickened with unease. Soldiers too felt the shadow lengthen. Patrols along river gates tightened, sentries grew restless, and captains whispered of Persian strength. They knew walls can protect against spears, but not against betrayal or thirst. Rumors spread that Cyrus himself studied the Euphrates, his eyes set not upon walls, but upon the river beneath them. Fear, once distant, began to creep closer, seeping into the cracks of daily life. The illusion of eternal safety was no longer unbroken. Common people felt this most deeply in silence. Mothers hushed children when they asked of armies. Farmers frowned at canals, wondering whether grain would sustain another year. Priests offered louder prayers, burning more incense, though their voices betrayed unease. Even in feasts where music roared, there were moments of stillness, sudden hushes when whispers of Persia pierced the noise. Fear became the invisible guest at every table, the unspoken presence in every hall. The law of fear had awakened. Enemies beyond the horizon no longer felt distant. They were in every rumor, every hesitation, every trembling voice. Fear itself had entered Babylon, soft-footed, invisible, relentless. And though walls still stood, fear had already begun its siege. Fear grew heavier, no longer a rumor, but a presence that walked beside the people of Babylon. Spies slipped through taverns, cloaked in plain garb, their ears tuned to whispers of discontent. Some served foreign masters, carrying secrets eastward, while others were Babylon's own, reporting suspicions back to kings who no longer trusted even their closest men. The empire became a hall of echoes, every word weighed, every glance measured. In such silence, fear did not weaken, it multiplied. Omens darkened the city. Priests gazed into the smoke of incense, into the flicker of flames, and proclaimed uncertain visions. One saw rivers receding, another saw lions prowling through deserted streets. The people listened with unease, for prophecy once reassured them, but now the visions contradicted each other, tangled like threads of a frayed cloth. If even the gods spoke with divided tongues, who could anchor the city's fate? Fear fed upon prophecy, growing stronger with every doubtful word. Alliances too began to tremble. Nobles whispered of Persia's rise, some secretly sending envoys to Cyrus, hedging their loyalty as a gambler hedges bets. Soldiers, sensing delay in wages, questioned whether their leaders could still protect them. Traders who once praised Babylon's walls began to dream of Persian roads swifter and more secure. Fear gnawed at loyalty, turning friends into opportunists, allies into shadows. In such atmosphere, betrayal was not an act but an inevitability. The city itself bore signs of tension. Gates were reinforced, guards patrolled night and day, but their eyes betrayed unease. The Euphrates flowed as always, yet its waters seemed quieter, as if complicit in secrets only time knew. Torches burned longer through the night, not for celebration but for vigilance. Families stored grain in silence, merchants hid silver in walls, and children grew accustomed to seeing worry crease every adult face. Babylon glittered, but beneath the glow was trembling. The law of fear pressed its lesson. Empires rarely collapse from the blow of an enemy's sword. They unravel first from within, undone by the weight of their own dread. Babylon's enemies had not yet crossed its walls, yet fear had already carved corridors of weakness through its heart. The horizon drew closer each day, and with it, the inevitable. In time, fear became prophecy. The people of Babylon could feel collapse before it arrived, as though the air itself grew heavier with every passing season. In markets, silence replaced laughter. Bargaining turned sharp, urgent, suspicious. Merchants glanced over their shoulders, aware that any transaction might be their last before roads closed or caravans vanished. Even children sensed the change. Their games quieted, their songs replaced with whispered questions about the Persians beyond the horizon. Fear was no longer an intruder. It had become a citizen. The king held court in splendor, but the jewels of his crown no longer dazzled. Eyes that once revered now looked past him, searching for reassurance he could not give. Priests spoke louder, their voices echoing in temples, but louder words brought no greater faith. In the hearts of the people, reverence turned brittle, ready to shatter at the first sign of disaster. Even the gods seemed silent, their statues glittering in torchlight, mute before the weight of destiny. Dreams darkened across the city. Mothers dreamt of rivers running dry, soldiers dreamt of gates crumbling, and nobles dreamt of feasts disrupted by foreign hands. These dreams became stories told in hushed tones, passed from neighbor to neighbor, until imagination blurred with reality. Fear seeded visions, visions seeded despair, and despair eroded the last threads of unity. A city that had once seen itself as eternal began to imagine its own ending, and imagination is often the first step toward fate. When Persian scouts finally approached, Babylon did not meet them with courage, but with resignation. The walls still towered, the river still flowed, but within the city hearts had already surrendered. Fear had drained strength long before a single spear struck stone. Families gathered their treasures in silence, nobles whispered of terms rather than defiance, and soldiers gazed into the horizon with hollow eyes. The enemy had not yet entered, but Babylon was already conquered. Thus the law of fear revealed its merciless truth. Empires fall not first to swords but to shadows. Babylon, glittering in splendor, crumbled within before it crumbled without. Fear was the unseen conqueror, the silent invader, the prophecy fulfilled before armies even marched. Enemies beyond the horizon had entered Babylon's soul, and from there no walls could keep them out. Betrayal begins quietly, like cracks in stone hidden beneath paint. Babylon's grandeur still shone outward. Its gates still blazed with blue tiles. Its towers still gleamed beneath the sun. But within, loyalty had already begun to fracture. Nobles whispered in private halls, weighing allegiance against survival. Some still clung to the king, but many sought secret channels to Persia, eager to trade loyalty for safety before the tide of war broke. Thrones, they knew, were built not on stone, but on shifting sands of trust. Priests, too, wavered. For generations they had stood as guardians of Babylon's gods, keepers of ritual and order. Yet even they began to wonder if the gods had shifted their favor. Incense still burned, chants still rose, but hearts faltered. Some priests whispered that Marduk himself had abandoned Babylon, drawn instead to the rising power of Cyrus. Betrayal of faith often comes before betrayal of crown, and here both began to entwine. Soldiers, bound by duty, were not immune. Wages faltered as coffers drained, loyalty wavered as silver grew scarce. Rumors of Persian generosity spread. Whispers that Cyrus rewarded those who bent the knee, sparing them ruin. A soldier facing hunger, debt, or despair weighed loyalty against life. Betrayal was not an act of malice, but of necessity, a choice made in silence while gripping a sword. Armies crumbled not only from battle but from bargains struck in shadow. The people themselves betrayed in subtler ways. Markets, once vibrant with Babylonian pride, now bartered with doubt. Merchants considered Persian roads more stable than Babylonian gates, and their silver began to flow in quiet currents eastward. Farmers withheld grain from royal storehouses, keeping it hidden in cellars, unwilling to trust that the palace would repay them in kind. Every small act of self-preservation was a pebble removed from the city's foundation. Betrayal was not only in halls of power, but in every household. The law of betrayal sharpened its lesson. Thrones are never toppled by swords alone, but by the silent erosion of loyalty. Babylon's majesty seemed eternal, yet it rested upon sand. Sand that slipped, grain by grain, beneath the weight of fear, greed, and survival. Betrayal deepened in whispers that became louder than proclamations. In the king's court, nobles gathered with smiles upon their lips, but suspicion in their hearts. Some offered lavish gifts to show loyalty, but behind their gestures lay secret letters dispatched under cover of night, addressed to Persian envoys waiting beyond the horizon. Each noble measured survival above devotion. The city's unity, once bound like stone, now fractured like clay pressed too thin. Priests bent omens to suit convenience. Where once the stars were read with solemnity, now their messages shifted with the winds of politics. To some, the heavens declared Babylon's strength unshaken. To others, the same constellations whispered of Persia's favor. Sacred prophecy became currency, bartered to whoever listened with coin or influence. The betrayal of truth hollowed the rituals, turning temples into theaters where fear and ambition performed in tandem. The gods themselves seemed silent, watching their voices twisted. Generals, keepers of walls and men faltered as well. Orders grew sluggish, patrols weakened, and hesitation festered like rot. Some commanders weighed whether resisting the Persians would bring honor or only needless death. Others courted Persian promises, believing surrender might preserve rank or life. Armies that once moved with discipline now moved with doubt, and doubt is the sharpest betrayal of all. Soldiers sense hesitation in their leaders as they sense weather in the air, and from it their hearts grow uncertain. Even the river was betrayed. Its gates, once sealed with vigilance, were left unwatched in moments of arrogance. Guards, bribed or careless, opened doors for those who should have been barred. The Euphrates, long protector, became pathway for enemies. Babylon betrayed itself in negligence, in greed, in the small cracks where vigilance once held firm. And when rivers are betrayed, walls crumble without battle. The law of betrayal revealed itself fully. No empire falls from enemies alone. It falls because trust fractures within, because loyalty is bartered for safety, because men turn inward when courage is demanded outward. Babylon glittered in splendor, but beneath the gold lay shifting sand, and sand cannot hold a throne forever. The final act of betrayal came not with clash of armies, but with the quiet surrender of trust. When Persian shadows lengthened on the horizon, Babylon's strength was already gone. Nobles who once swore oaths beneath the throne now whispered terms of surrender, each seeking to save their wealth and bloodlines. They offered secrets of gates, maps of canals, and promises of silence. Gold purchased loyalty no longer for the king, but for his enemies. Thrones topple most swiftly when guardians become guides for invaders. Priests, too, played their part. In temples heavy with incense, they spoke of visions where Marduk's favor had shifted eastward, away from Babylon toward Cyrus. To the weary people, such words carried weight. If the gods themselves had abandoned the city, why should men cling to its crown? Ritual became resignation. Prayers became preparation for surrender. The betrayal of faith sealed the betrayal of empire. Soldiers, starving of wages and weary of waiting, found themselves torn between loyalty and survival. Some laid down arms, others opened gates, others vanished into alleys before battle began. The walls still stood, their towers unbroken, but walls cannot fight when hearts behind them falter. Babylon was betrayed not only by generals who hesitated, but by soldiers who chose silence over defiance. Spears grow dull when conviction dies. The people, who once filled markets with songs, betrayed through silence as well. They did not rise in defense, did not rally to walls, but watched as Persians slipped along the emptied riverbeds. Fear had dulled them, hunger had weakened them, betrayal had numbed them. No rebellion, no uprising, no resistance met the invader. Babylon fell not with fire and blood, but with a quiet surrender, a city betraying itself in its final hour. Thus the law of betrayal spoke its judgment. Empires collapse most swiftly from within. Thrones built on loyalty endure only when trust remains unbroken. Babylon's grandeur, its feasts and markets, its temples and towers, were undone not by Persian cunning alone, but by betrayal sown in every corner. The empire stood upon sand, and when the tide came, it vanished. When empires fall, we imagine thunder, walls crashing, fires raging, armies colliding in storm. Yet Babylon fell differently. It did not collapse in a roar, but in silence. The night of its undoing was strangely calm. No alarms rang from towers, no horns cried warning. Instead, the city breathed as if nothing were wrong, feasting and singing, even as its fate was already sealed beyond its walls. Collapse does not always come with fire. Sometimes it arrives like sleep, slow and silent. The Euphrates ran shallow that night, its waters pulled away by Persian channels. Soldiers crept along its bed, their boots sinking into mud, their steps swallowed by silence. Gates along the river, left unwatched in arrogance or opened in betrayal, yielded without struggle. The city that once boasted of impenetrable defenses was entered as though by shadows slipping through cracks. No battle thundered. Only the river's quiet gurgle marked the invasion. Within the city, feasts still roared. Nobles reclined in lamplight. Musicians plucked strings, dancers spun in jeweled robes. Cups were raised to eternity, to the gods, to walls said to be unbreakable. Yet even in revelry, silence pressed in. It was in the pause between songs, in the hollow ring of laughter, in the glance of servants who knew unease. The city sang loudly, but silence had already taken root, coiled around the heart of Babylon like a serpent waiting for dawn. Ordinary people felt it most. They lay in their homes listening to faint sounds beyond the river, uncertain if they were dreams or omens. Children stirred in sleep, sensing what adults would not name. Mothers pressed hands to their children's hair, whispering prayers to gods who seemed far away. Silence deepened in every alley, in every courtyard, in every breath of the night. When collapse nears, the world grows quieter, as though even sound prepares for the end. The law of silence revealed itself in that hour. Empires need not fall in chaos. They may fall in stillness, undone by the absence of resistance, the weight of inevitability, the surrender of voices. Babylon, crowned in splendor, did not cry out as it fell. And in that silence, its story became a prophecy that all empires end, not always in roar but often in whisper. The Persians entered Babylon not as thunder but as shadow. Their sandals pressed softly into the mud of the riverbed, their torches muted against the night. They did not storm gates with fire, nor batter walls with iron. They slipped beneath the city's pride like water through cracks, patient, deliberate, invisible. The silence of their entry was the truest weapon, for silence has no opponent. The city slept, even as it was conquered. The feasts faltered only when news crept into halls. A servant whispered of movement by the river. A soldier's absence at his post raised unease. Yet the nobles dismissed such murmurs at first, their cups still raised, their songs still sung. What empire, they believed, could fall in a single night? But silence thickened, pressing against the noise until laughter grew strained, music slowed and dancers turned uneasy. A hush deeper than fear coiled around them. Temples, once thunderous with chant, dimmed as well. Priests burned incense with trembling hands, their eyes darting to doors where shadows lengthened. The statues of gods glittered in torchlight, but their mouths did not speak, their hands did not move. Faith had once filled the city with certainty. Now the silence of the divine seemed louder than any prophecy. The people looked to heaven for command, but heaven answered with quiet. That quiet spread like mist across the city, heavier than any army. Ordinary citizens awoke to unease. They heard unfamiliar footsteps echoing in alleys, foreign voices carried on the wind. But no horns sounded, no calls to arms stirred them. Families remained within their homes, whispering prayers but never cries of resistance. They clung to silence because silence was safer, because silence allowed hope that maybe all was not yet lost. But silence is surrender in disguise, and by it, Babylon yielded without struggle. The law of silence showed its cruel clarity. Empires collapse not always with struggle, but with stillness. When voices die, when resistance fades, when fear and resignation bind tongues, the city has already fallen. The Persians did not conquer Babylon in battle. They entered a silence that had been prepared long before their arrival. At last, silence settled upon Babylon like a final veil. The Persians moved through its avenues with measured steps, meeting no clash of arms, hearing no cries of defiance. The streets, once alive with music, bargaining and laughter, now echoed only with the shuffle of boots and the distant call of owls. It was as if the city itself had chosen to hold its breath, unwilling to disturb the inevitability unfolding within its walls. Palaces, once bright with torches, dimmed in uneasy hush. Musicians laid down their instruments. Dancers froze mid-motion. Nobles sat wide-eyed as foreign soldiers entered without resistance. The grand halls that had thundered with laughter and song just hours before now swallowed every sound. Fear had done its work long before the Persians arrived. The silence of collapse was only its final refrain. Thrones, when they fall, rarely echo. They dissolve into stillness. In temples, priests bowed low, not to resist but to accept. The incense still burned, curling upward in fragile spirals, but their chants faltered. They did not pray for victory, they prayed for mercy. Statues of gods watched unmoving, their golden eyes reflecting foreign torches. Silence filled the sacred chambers, so heavy that even whispered prayers seemed too loud. When gods themselves do not answer, mortals find surrender easier than faith. The people of Babylon hid behind their doors, pressing children close, their whispers little more than breaths. Some shed tears, though quietly, afraid even grief might be heard. Others stared into darkness, knowing that what they witnessed was the end of their world, yet unable to speak against it. No uprising, no rebellion, no final cry marked the empire's passing. Instead, silence bore it away, as gentle and merciless as the tide. Thus, the law of silence sealed its truth. Empires do not always end in noise. Sometimes they end in quiet surrender, in voices stilled by fear, in hearts subdued by inevitability. Babylon, city of walls and wonders, slipped into history not with a roar, but with a whisper. And in that whisper, the stars above bore witness, unblinking, eternal, while the city that once called itself eternal dissolved into the silence of time. When cities fall, they do not vanish. Their walls may crumble, their palaces may fade into ruin, but their stories linger like dust upon the wind. Babylon, once crowned eternal, became dust upon the lips of poets, prophecy upon the tongues of seers, memory carved into the minds of generations. The silence of its fall did not erase it, rather silence made it immortal, for what is remembered outlives what is built, and memory is the truest empire. Travelers came upon the ruins and felt whispers in the stone. The broken gates, the toppled bricks, the silent river, all spoke of a city that had once commanded the world. Some called it a warning, others a wonder. To walk its empty streets was to feel both reverence and dread, as though the city still breathed beneath its dust, waiting to rise again. Memory gave Babylon a second life, though not one its kings had intended. Prophets seized upon its fall as lesson. They told of arrogance punished, of wealth squandered, of gods offended by excess and betrayal. They spoke of writing on the wall, of divine hands shaping destiny, of empires humbled by fate's patient hand. Each retelling sharpened Babylon's image until it became more than city. It became symbol. To invoke Babylon was to invoke warning, to speak not only of history but of destiny. The ruins became scripture, and memory became judgment. Merchants, too, carried echoes with them. Along caravan routes, they told stories of the great city that had once drawn all goods into its heart. They spoke of markets that dazzled, walls that loomed, feasts that roared, and of the silence that swallowed it all in a single night. These tales traveled farther than spices, carried into lands that had never seen Babylon. In distant taverns, its story was retold as both marvel and caution, a reminder that no market, however rich, is unbreakable. Thus the law of memory stirred. Babylon's stones may have fallen, but its image stood taller than ever, preserved not in walls but in words, not in towers but in tales. What the city lost in power, it gained in prophecy. The dust of Babylon became seed, and from it grew myths, lessons, and echoes that shaped the world long after its silence. Memory is never neutral. Each generation shapes it to its own needs, carving meaning into ruins like inscriptions upon clay. The Persians, who inherited Babylon, spoke of its fall as proof of Cyrus's wisdom, a sign that divine order had chosen him over arrogant kings. They preserved the city's temples, honored its rituals, but reshaped the story. Babylon had not simply fallen, it had been delivered into better hands. Memory, bent to their will, became justification for empire. Later, Greek travelers arrived, their eyes wide with awe. To them, Babylon's walls seemed impossibly vast, its gardens rumored to hang like paradise itself. They told stories of towers scraping heaven, of wonders too grand for mortals. Yet even as they marveled, they warned, here lay proof that even the greatest splendor cannot outlast time. Herodotus and his successors wove Babylon into myth, part wonder, part caution, its memory sharpened into fable. The ruins became mirrors, where Greece saw both ambition and fragility. Priests of distant lands seized Babylon's memory as sermon. In scriptures, it became symbol of arrogance, of towers built to defy heaven, of kings who mistook abundance for eternity. Its fall was not merely history, but parable, divine justice written in dust. The name Babylon came to mean more than city. It meant corruption, pride, downfall. The memory of its silence became louder than the city itself had ever been. To speak Babylon was to warn of fate's patience. Among the common people, memory spread in softer ways. Merchants recited stories of its markets as legend, singers turned its downfall into song, mothers whispered of it in bedtime tales. For them, Babylon was both dream and warning, a place of wonder too great to last, a place where silence proved stronger than walls. Its memory lived not only in chronicles and scriptures, but in the everyday speech of generations who never saw its gates. Thus memory multiplied, bending in many directions yet always carrying the same shadow, greatness undone. The law of memory revealed itself fully. Empires survive in story longer than in stone. What men build crumbles, but what men remember endures. Babylon's silence became prophecy retold across ages, shaping visions of every empire that rose after. Its echo in the dust was louder than its voice in its prime. With time, Babylon's memory left its ruins and entered eternity. Long after its bricks were scattered, its name still carried weight. To speak of Babylon was to speak of power undone, of glory transmuted into lesson. Poets invoked it as metaphor for hubris, prophets thundered its name as warning, and dreamers imagined it as paradise lost. The city, gone in stone, lived endlessly in word. This was the empire of memory, and it outlasted kings. In later ages, rulers measured themselves against Babylon, some vowing never to repeat its mistakes, others secretly longing to recreate its splendor. The Roman forums echoed with comparisons, Persian kings whispered of it in strategy, and medieval monks wove it into allegories of temptation and fall. The city became symbol more than fact, the stage upon which each age projected its fears, its ambitions, its morality. Babylon was never forgotten, because forgetting would mean forgetting the fragility of power itself. Prophecy clung to it like shadow, the story of writing on the wall, the hand of fate that declared the city's doom, became scripture read for centuries. Every empire heard those words and shuddered. Your days are numbered. The phrase transcended Babylon and became warning for all who ruled. The silence of its fall was not final. It was retold as thunder, echoing through pulpits, courts, and palaces. Babylon became eternal not by survival, but by serving as omen. Even in the modern age, Babylon's name lingers. Archaeologists uncover fragments of walls, bricks stamped with royal seals, shards of tablets inscribed with contracts and prayers. Yet even these fragments are more than relics. They are echoes. Each piece tells the story of a city whose dust became louder than its drums, whose silence became more lasting than its songs. Memory transforms ruin into scripture, dust into prophecy, silence into eternal voice. Thus, the law of memory closed its lesson. No empire ends when it falls. It ends when it is forgotten. Babylon, though reduced to ruins, was never erased. Its name became timeless, a mirror in which every age sees its reflection. The dust of Babylon whispers still, and in that whisper lies the truth that memory is stronger than stone, and story endures longer than empire. Night gathers its ink, and the city listens. A hush settles on tiles blue as deep water, on lions whose glazed eyes gleam with captive stars. Far above, constellations keep their ancient counsel. Far below, a single lamp trembles in a scribe's room. He leans over wet clay, tracing wedges like footfalls of fate, and pauses when the flame gutters. Breath held. In the corridor, sandals whisper past. Somewhere in the palace, a goblet rings, thin, bright, doomed. Prophecy seldom announces itself with thunder. It arrives as a tremor in the cup, a flicker at the wick, a word that refuses to be swallowed. The old astrologer knows this language of small events. He climbs the shadowed steps of a temple tower with a bowl of water and a reed. On the bowl's surface, the stars appear as trembling seeds. He draws them gently closer with the reed and watches the pattern warp. Not a trick, not a miracle, simply the river of the sky folding over a mortal's question. He thinks of the canal workers with mud to their knees, of the market's thinning spice scent, of the king's bracelets chiming louder than his counselors. He thinks, and he writes nothing. To write is to bind. Tonight is for listening. Below, the banquet's heat swells. Oil light runs like honey across bronze platters. Laughter climbs and collapses like a musician's hand. A courtesan pauses, sensing an absence where music should be, as if a note has slipped away to stand at the door. She looks and sees only darkness, the ordinary kind that pools between torches. Yet her skin knows the other kind, the one that comes before a wave breaks, the one that turns a listener into witness. She takes a sip and tastes ash in sweet wine. Perhaps a lamp smokes. Perhaps time has exhaled across the rim. Prophets are seldom welcomed in full light. They gather with the fishermen under reed thatches before dawn, trading silence for weather and sky. They whisper of an eclipse that arrived one breath early, of a comet's tail that thinned too soon, tiny misalignments like threads pulled from a woven cloak. Do not say the word, one warns, and everyone understands. Not Babylon, not fall. They speak instead of birds that refuse to rise at clapping hands, of dogs that howled facing the river, of a bronze gate that stuck for the first time in memory. Small prophecies, each one, but prophecies still. There is a tale the washerwomen keep. They tell it at midday when the stones burn hot and the river gives back the sun. A child once etched letters on a wall with a shard of blue tile, writing his name larger than a king's. The tile cut his finger. He wiped the blood across his letters and laughed until evening, when his mother found the streak and scolded him. By morning, rain had licked the wall clean. Nothing remained. Names written too large wash away, the women say. Say your name small, say it soft, say it like a prayer. The tale passes along the river, through alleys and into chambers, where men carry seals heavy as guilt. The high priest wakes in the second watch. He has dreamt of grain piled to the ceiling, while mice dance in the rafters unchecked. He hears distant drums from the palace and tries to remember whether feast days have multiplied or whether time itself has broken into more nights to accommodate them. He lights a brazier and feeds it cedar chips. The smoke rises in disciplined ribbons, then frays. He waits for a sign to gather, a sentence to lift from the embers, but the smoke refuses grammar. It turns on itself, a serpent eating its tail, a law circling to its first letter. He feels a humiliation he cannot name, to be a guardian of voices and hear only the weight of his own breath. On the ramparts, a young sentry counts heartbeats, not from fear, but from habit learned in training yards where rhythm can be the difference between standing and falling. The night wind tastes of tamarisk and distant marshes. From the riverbed below, a sound rises that is not quite footfall, not quite water. He leans over, sees only the pale back of the current turning stones. He remembers his father's warning, trust the river but never believe it. Belief belongs to gods, trust belongs to struggle. He repeats the words softly, so they will be there later, when he will need them, when the difference between trust and belief will open like a gate. An old tablet in a back room of the archive gives off the faint fragrance of baked dust when a scholar lifts it. The signs are clear: a debt, a date, a clause about penalty. But a margin mark arrests him, a minuscule star scratched beside the line where the borrower pledges his harvest. So long as the river rises. The scholar strokes that star with a fingertip, as if it were a bruise. So long as the river rises. As if promises had tides. As if honor itself could run shallow. He remembers a proverb older than the walls: never swear by what moves. He sets the tablet down and feels the shelves around him breathing, clay upon clay, contracts that endured past their signers, quiet as tombs, loud as thunder. At the banquet, the king lifts a cup etched with lions mid-leap. He holds it up to the fire. Red swims across his face like a delayed sunset. He is not a cruel man, not tonight. He is a tired man pretending to be a star. He jokes with a cousin, notices a crack in a platter that should have been discarded, instructs a servant to seek out a new song. He does not see the seam in the wall where plaster has been hastily smoothed, or the small spider startled from its food when the brick warmed quicker than usual. He does not see, because kings rarely do. The world keeps a little mercy for those who must carry it, and that mercy is called forgetting. Omens collect. A jar slips from a girl's hands in the market and does not break. It shivers, rolls to a halt as if obeying a different slope. A date palm bears fruit out of season, and the fruit is sweet, as if the tree had stored a summer's worth of regret. A dog refuses to cross the palace threshold, digging its nails into dust, eyes fixed upon a darkness that no one else can see. A bronze bell calls the last watch and sounds twice. Not an echo, a second sound misplaced beside the first, a twin born late. No one agrees what any of it means, but everyone keeps the meanings close. Prophecy lives where dread meets devotion. A widow rises from her mat and washes the threshold clean with river water and tears. She writes nothing, yet the line of dampness curling under the door is a letter the night can read. A boy grips his toy chariot so tight, the wheel leaves a ring on his palm. His imprint will fade by morning, but for an hour it is a crown. A boatman poises his pole and decides against crossing to the far bank after all, though no sandbar threatens him. He says later the current turned strange and thin, like a whisper trying to become a word. These are not portents to carve in stone. They are breath against glass. They fog, they clear, they return. The city's storytellers understand that a message does not need ink to endure. They whisper it in courtyards, while the moon moves like a slow drum behind smoke. They shape parables small enough to survive every search. Do not pour wine into cracked cups. Do not shout your sleep. Do not hang lamps from tired nails. Somewhere in those parables waits the one they do not say aloud, the one about the sentence that arrives without a mouth, that writes itself on the nerve and the night and the wall. They save that for when the air thins and the torches sputter. They save it for the moment when no one will say it and everyone will know. An old man of the scribes keeps a reed hidden in his sleeve, a habit he learned as a boy when his master taught. The tool must be ready when the sign appears, not a moment later. He has waited decades for a sign worth making into public clay. He has copied contracts, prayers, lists of barley, letters to sons who never returned. He has recorded floods and prices and eclipses, each one important for a day, a season, an argument. He has never yet set down a sentence that felt heavier than the brick it marked. Tonight his hand aches as if remembering an alphabet not yet spoken. He rubs his wrist. He waits. Somewhere, a scorpion finds its way into the palace by traveling the cool stone line where wall meets floor. It stops half the distance from a torch and lifts its tail, a punctuation mark searching for its sentence. Somewhere else, a moth burns itself on a brass lamp and falls like a charred word onto the lip of a cup. Somewhere else, invisible to everyone but the river and the stars, a path of damp earth is opening where the water will be asked to go. The city breathes. The city hesitates. Between the second heartbeat and the third, a seam in the night splits as easily as a thought. No one will admit it in the morning, but many will feel it now. The arrival without a footstep. Not a person. Not yet a vision. A correctness, like the single note that aligns a room full of instruments. Hair lifts on forearms, lamps steady. The old astrologer lowers his bowl and sees the stars in their places, and understands that that, too, is a sign. The writer in the archive lifts his reed. The sentry on the wall starts to count again, and forgets the number at 10. The high priest whispers a name that is not a name and hears no answer. The widow lays her palm on the wet threshold and closes her eyes, as if receiving a seal. Soon there will be letters that do not come from any hand. Soon there will be a sentence short as a blade and heavy as a gate. But prophecy does not begin with writing. Writing is only the mercy of the end. Prophecy begins with the city learning to listen, to the wobble in the cup, the seam in the plaster, the second bell, the reed that aches to be used, the river that pretends to be loyal and never is. It begins with a night like this one, when silence turns from sleep into summons, and even the most gilded hall knows it is only a chamber in a larger mouth. The lamp trembles again and holds, breath held. The wall waits. Prophecy does not belong to palaces alone. It seeps into alleys, into taverns where oil lamps swing above cracked tables, into courtyards where women grind grain in rhythm with gossip. The city speaks through fragments, and fragments carry weight. A trader returns from the east with news of stars studied by Persian magi, their calculations precise as blades. He whispers that they too have seen omens. Babylon's season is ending, another crown will rise. His words pass from ear to ear, no louder than breath, yet louder than any decree. Fear spreads best when wrapped in prophecy. One night, in the shadow of the ziggurat, a flame bends against wind though the air is still. The acolytes see it, exchange wary glances but record nothing. To write would be to summon. Instead they bow lower, their chants quivering like reeds shaken by unseen current. The elder among them murmurs that fire obeys not man but fate, and that fate has already turned its gaze elsewhere. His words vanish into incense, but the silence after them remains. The banquet hall continues to gleam, though shadows gather at its edges. Walls painted with battles seem to move in torchlight, the figures of lions and archers shifting as though alive. Courtiers laugh to drown unease, yet each laughter feels brittle, breaking before its echo returns. Some glance toward the plaster of the walls, as if expecting letters to surface unbidden. They drink deeper to forget the thought, yet the thought lingers. In silence, each cup tastes like omen. Prophets from the river quarters arrive barefoot, their robes torn, their eyes unblinking. They speak of hands larger than the sky, of writing that needs no ink, of words that cannot be erased. The guards scoff, chasing them away with the butts of spears, yet even scoffing spreads the tale. A single dismissed prophecy has more power than 100 honored ones. What men deny too fiercely becomes the thing they remember most. In the archives, a clay tablet is broken by accident. Its edges fall away, leaving a fragment with a half-written word. The scribe who discovers it stares long into the broken wedge marks, uncertain whether the missing letters are lost or merely hidden. He imagines the absent strokes completing themselves upon the wall. He tells no one, but that night he dreams of letters burning above the city, letters he cannot pronounce. When he wakes, he still tastes ash. Beyond the city gates, shepherds tell their own version of prophecy. They speak of stars that move like armies, of rivers that shrink like vanquished lines, of dogs that whine when smoke drifts from the east. They have no tablets, no temples, only silence broken by the lowing of cattle. Yet their prophecy spreads, for silence itself gives it weight. Each man who hears it feels the same chill. Prophecy does not need scholars nor kings. It needs only repetition. The law of prophecy grows clearer with each whisper. Words unbidden strike deeper than decrees. They are not chosen but revealed, not debated but endured. The city begins to carry prophecy in its marrow. A child who drops her toy hears doom in its crack. A bride who sees her candle sputter reads the end of dynasties. A merchant who watches coins scatter imagines crowns falling. Omens no longer belong to temples. They belong to every pair of eyes, every tongue too afraid to name them aloud. The palace resists, but prophecy seeps through its stones. One evening, as musicians play, a thread of plaster falls from the wall above the king's head, landing silently in his goblet. He drinks without noticing, but courtiers see. They do not speak, yet their eyes meet with the same understanding. Walls themselves have begun to write. No decree can erase plaster dust once swallowed. No king can forbid a sign that has already entered the body. Thus part 2 closes in silence heavy with signs. The writing has not yet appeared, but the city already reads it. In fire bending against still air, in broken tablets, in dreams of ash, in plaster falling into wine. Prophecy is no longer distant. It lives in every gesture, every shadow, every glance toward the wall. Babylon waits, breath held, for letters not yet written, but already true. The night of the writing arrives without heralds. Babylon feasts as it always has. Tables heavy with roasted lamb, goblets spilling with wine, laughter ringing against painted walls. Music thrums through the palace, steady and unbroken, but beneath it waits a silence, patient as a predator. The air is thick with smoke from torches, with the perfume of oils, with the dull weight of excess. The people gathered here do not know it, but the walls are listening. At first, the sign is subtle, a torch guttering though oil remains, a servant trembling without cause, his tray rattling like bones. Then, in the far corner of the hall, light folds strangely against plaster. Shapes flicker, not flame, not shadow, strokes. At once the music falters, eyes turn, and there it is, letters forming without hand, glowing like molten silver pressed into clay. The writing has no voice, yet it shouts louder than trumpet or drum. Men stagger to their feet, women cover their mouths. The king himself freezes, goblet lifted halfway. The letters march across the wall with terrible calm, each one a sentence carved into silence. No scribe moves, no priest dares to read. They all know the language, yet none dares to name the words aloud. To speak prophecy is to become its servant, and none wishes to bear that burden. So the hall waits, held captive by letters burning on stone. The message is short, but brevity is its power. Fewer strokes than a prayer, fewer words than a decree. Yet each line is heavier than armies. The letters glow, fade, and glow again, as if the wall itself is alive with breath. The music does not resume. The feast is forgotten. All Babylon listens to silence turned into script. It is the silence of judgment, the silence of destiny, the silence that no crown can forbid. At last an elder priest breaks. His knees tremble as he bows before the letters, his lips forming sounds as if to read them. But the king stops him with a lifted hand. Pride lingers even here, even now. He cannot bear that doom be spoken aloud in his hall. He commands the torches raised higher, as though light could erase what fire itself did not create. Yet the words remain. Light only sharpens them, each stroke a wound across the plaster. Outside, the city grows restless. Rumors of light upon the walls spill from servants into streets, from streets into markets, from markets into every home. Mothers hush children more sternly than usual. Fathers sit staring into the dark as if waiting for soundless commands. The prophecy has left the palace. It runs in every whisper, every shudder, every prayer half spoken. Babylon itself has begun to read. The night deepens, the writing fades, but its absence is worse than its presence. The wall stands bare again, and yet every glance finds the letters still there, seared into the eye, carved into memory. No brush, no plaster, no time can erase them. What once was warning is now law. The city has been judged, and judgment cannot be unwritten. The king retires to his chamber but does not sleep. He stares into the shadows where the wall meets the floor, expecting new letters to rise. Servants bring incense, music, and soft words, but none can soothe him. He remembers the goblet's tremor, the plaster's fall, the priest's dream of mice. He remembers every omen ignored, every whisper silenced, every warning turned aside. They return now as a chorus, relentless, inescapable. The writing is only the last word of a sentence spoken for years. In the temples, priests chant louder than before, desperate to smother fear with ritual. They pour oil upon flames until smoke chokes the air, but the gods remain silent. Statues gleam, unmoving, their golden eyes indifferent to human panic. Faith falters where prophecy rules, for when walls themselves speak, what need have men of priests? When judgment appears in light, what use are incense and chants? The people see it clearly. Prophecy has passed from mouth to stone. The law of prophecy declares itself complete. Words written without hand bind stronger than swords. They require no armies, no arguments, no witnesses beyond silence. Babylon has been weighed, and in the weighing its walls crumble though they still stand. The markets may roar tomorrow, the feasts may resume, but the city's heart has shifted. Its fate is sealed, its story already carried forward in dust and echo. In the streets, children scratch mock letters on walls with bits of tile, imitating what they have heard. They laugh, but their laughter trembles. Merchants close stalls early, muttering that trade will not save them if even the plaster speaks. Soldiers patrol in silence, gripping spears tightly as though they might pierce words themselves. The city no longer fears invasion alone. It fears the sentence already written upon it. And above it all, the stars look down, indifferent. They have seen Akkad weighed and found wanting, Assyria judged, Sumer dissolved into sand. They have watched Babylon's rise, and now they witness its sentence. The constellations blink slowly, like eyes closing in weary repetition. To them, this writing is no surprise. Prophecy is not revelation, but remembrance, for the stars know that every empire carries its own end in its first stone. By dawn, the words are gone, the wall blank again. Yet Babylon knows they remain, unseen but unerasable. The king summons counselors, demands interpretations, but every explanation sounds like echo. None dare say what all already know. The writing is not warning, but verdict. The city has been measured against time, and time has claimed its due. Thus the law of prophecy closes. The writing on the wall is more than letters. It is the mirror held to every throne, every market, every feast. It shows that power is borrowed, wealth is tied, and walls are paper when time decides to write. Babylon read its judgment in silence, and the silence was enough. For once written, prophecy does not fade. It lingers in memory, in dust, in the stars themselves, waiting to be read again by every empire that dares to call itself eternal. Hunger enters quietly. It does not storm gates or break walls. It slips in through neglected canals, through caravans that never arrive, through silos that echo when knocked. At first, the city hardly notices. Bread loaves are smaller, honey jars thinner, meat portions carved more carefully. The market still bustles, but the scents are fewer, the colors dimmer. Whispers rise, not of Persia, not of rivers, but of grain, the one enemy no sword can strike. Granaries once swollen with barley begin to hollow. Rats find more space to run between the sacks. Dust gathers where grain once overflowed, and merchants weigh silver against emptiness. Farmers grumble that fields yield less, that drought tightens its hand on the river's veins. Still the king assures his people the city is eternal. Still the priests chant that Marduk will not abandon them, yet hunger grows teeth in silence, sharper than steel. Mothers stretch bread with ground dates and water, pressing thin cakes on stone hearths that crackle too quickly. Children chew slowly, learning early that small bites must last. Soldiers accept rations without complaint, but their eyes drift toward fields beyond walls where golden barley waves beyond reach. Hunger teaches patience, but patience is not strength. It is surrender measured in time. Merchants hoard. What little grain enters the city is hidden in back rooms, sold in whispers at triple price. Silver flows faster, but bread slows, and resentment spreads like fire among dry reeds. Hunger makes men forget loyalty. Hunger makes neighbors into rivals, allies into thieves. In taverns, arguments break out not over politics, but over crumbs. A crust dropped on the floor becomes cause for fists. Priests burn incense more heavily, yet the smell does not mask emptiness. They chant for the gods to fill silos, but silos remain hollow. Their words rise into smoky rafters, unanswered, unanswered, unanswered. The people bow, but their bellies bow lower, teaching them a harsher truth. Prayers do not fill granaries. Hunger is a god in itself, and it demands worship in silence, in sacrifice, in despair. Thus the law of hunger reveals its opening truth. Famine is not absence, but weapon. Grain withheld is sharper than sword, quieter than spear, and no wall, however high, can keep it out. Babylon, full of treasures, begins to starve not for gold, but for bread. Hunger does not weaken swiftly. It lingers, eroding strength like a river cutting stone. Weeks pass, and the city learns new rhythms. The rhythm of ration lines, the rhythm of hollow bowls, the rhythm of silence when children ask for food that does not exist. The bazaar, once a theater of abundance, now feels like a hushed chamber. Stalls that once overflowed with spices and fruit now display only a few sacks, guarded like jewels. Eyes linger too long, hands twitch toward theft, trust dissolves. Riots spark not in grand avenues but in alleys, where bread is carried in baskets too openly. A single loaf can draw a crowd, voices rising, arms reaching, blows exchanged. Soldiers intervene with spears, but even they must eat, and their rations shrink daily. The people stare at their guardians and wonder how long loyalty lasts when hunger deepens. The throne no longer feels steady. Its weight shifts with every empty stomach. The poor suffer first, but hunger is a patient conqueror. It climbs stairways, enters courtyards, slips through bronze doors. Even nobles taste it. Their feasts grow smaller, their wines less sweet. Their tables lined with foods meant more for show than for nourishment. Behind the curtains, their servants murmur of hidden stores locked in cellars. In darkness, resentment festers. Servants who once bowed now dream of stealing keys. Hunger teaches rebellion in silence, one growl at a time. Priests attempt to weave famine into myth. They proclaim the gods are testing Babylon, that hunger is fire to burn away pride. Yet their words stumble when the people see the temple storerooms guarded and full. Whispers grow. The priests feast in secret while children starve. Whether true or not, the rumor spreads like disease. Faith, already shaken, begins to fracture. When gods do not fill bowls, bowls become altars to despair. Markets adapt in cruel ways. Grain becomes coin heavier than silver. A handful of barley can buy a day's labor. A sack can purchase loyalty. Debts multiply, carved onto clay tablets that bind families for generations. Hunger reshapes power more surely than battles. Those who hold food hold lives. Merchants become kings of alleys, their stores guarded more tightly than temples. The law of hunger bends the city into new hierarchies, where crowns matter less than crusts. Children cry more softly now. At first they wailed, fists pounding against mothers' robes. Now they whimper, voices thin, bodies lighter. Silence spreads not from obedience but from exhaustion. Songs vanish from the streets, laughter from doorways. Even festivals fade. Musicians' fingers lack strength, dancers lack breath, and torches burn to empty courts. Hunger eats not only the body but the spirit until Babylon itself seems to grow gaunt. Yet the king still clings to ritual. He orders banquets, though the tables hold less each month. He commands musicians to play, though their cheeks hollow. He lifts his goblet in defiance, though the wine tastes thinner. To abandon display would be to admit weakness, and pride refuses surrender. But the people see through gilded feasts. They see the distance between their empty bowls and the king's half-filled plate, and the distance feels wider than the walls themselves. The law of hunger presses deeper. It teaches that famine is not chaos. It is order inverted. Wealth becomes worthless, temples become suspect, loyalty becomes fragile, and silence becomes prophecy. Babylon still stands, its towers intact, its gates unbroken. Yet hunger has already breached the walls. The city no longer asks whether it will fall, but when and how many stomachs will groan before the silence claims them all. Hunger sharpens into its final shape when the Persians turn it into a blade. They know the city's strength lies not only in walls, but in bread. Armies can outweight armies, but no kingdom can outweight an empty granary. And so, caravans are cut, canals disrupted, fields beyond reach left to wither under foreign patrols. The siege does not thunder with catapults or battering rams. It whispers in silence, in emptiness, in bellies tightening day after day. Inside Babylon, desperation deepens. Grain is hoarded in secret corners, sealed behind doors that neighbors learn to watch. Smells of cooking, once common, now betray families to theft. At night, footsteps echo louder, not of soldiers patrolling but of hungry men slipping through alleys in search of crumbs. Mothers learn to hide crusts beneath mats. Fathers risk their lives to barter with strangers for sacks never seen again. Hunger breeds shadows, and shadows are merciless. The throne feels the pressure most acutely. Courtiers press the king with demands for release of reserves, but reserves are smoke. Long consumed, long gone. The king holds feasts still, though smaller, though strained, though increasingly hollow. Every goblet lifted becomes a mockery, every platter an accusation. The people no longer see grandeur in their ruler. They see distance, denial, and arrogance. Hunger turns loyalty brittle, brittle enough to break with the faintest touch. Temples, too, lose their hold. Incense burns, but the smell is nausea to those who hunger. Gold gleams on statues, but worshippers glare at untouched offerings piled high before gods who will not bend. Some whisper that the gods themselves are being starved, abandoned by a people who no longer believe. Faith slips into doubt, doubt into silence, silence into rage. Hunger unmakes not only bodies but the very myths that bind them. Children waste away, their limbs thin as reeds, their eyes too large for their faces. Their cries fade into whimpers, their whimpers into sleep that sometimes does not end. Families bury quietly in courtyards, covering small forms with earth while neighbors pretend not to see. The city once called eternal now feels mortal in every stone, every shadow. Hunger has no need for soldiers. It conquers with emptiness alone. The Persians wait. They need not strike. Every day the river carries less grain into the gates. Every night the city grows weaker. Every dawn more voices are missing from the markets. Hunger does their work for them. When walls are too high, bread becomes the ladder. When armies are too proud, famine becomes the negotiator. The law of hunger proves itself absolute. Where swords fail, scarcity triumphs. In the final weeks, Babylon becomes a ghost of itself. Musicians no longer play, dancers no longer dance, markets no longer sing. Silence spreads where once abundance roared. Even the feasts of nobles are quiet, their plates a meager imitation of past glory. The king lifts his goblet one last time, but his hand trembles. The wine within tastes of ash. His crown weighs heavier than his hunger, but not heavier than the hunger of his people. And so when Persians finally step across the riverbed and into the city, they find not resistance, but resignation. The people do not rise, for they lack strength. Soldiers lay down arms, for they lack bread. Priests bow low, for their gods have gone silent. The city does not fall in battle. It collapses in famine, undone by the simplest law of all. No empire survives when grain is gone. The law of hunger closes with its cruel truth. Bread is throne, bread is crown, bread is empire. Take it away, and walls crumble, markets empty, temples darken, and kings bow. Babylon, jewel of rivers, master of markets, guardian of walls, learned its most merciless lesson. Hunger is the oldest conqueror, and it leaves no city unbroken. Gold gleamed brighter as hunger deepened. In Babylon's final years, wealth did not vanish. It multiplied, hoarded in temples, locked in treasuries, piled in chambers where no hand dared touch it. The city glittered with metal, even as bellies shrank, and the contrast grew sharper than any blade. Coins rang louder than prayers, but their sound was hollow, mocking. For what is gold when bread is gone? What is treasure when hunger gnaws at every wall? The nobles carried themselves with pride, their garments stitched with threads of silver, their jewels heavy upon weary necks. They clinked coins into cups, believing wealth itself was shield against fate. Yet wealth does not feed, does not guard, does not endure beyond silence. The people watched, eyes sunken, as nobles paraded splendor through streets that smelled of dust and smoke. Their silence was not reverence. It was bitterness, deep and sharp, a wound carved by inequality. In markets, gold betrayed itself. Merchants raised their prices until silver lost meaning, then demanded payment in grain, then in loyalty, then in silence. Coins once traded with joy now carried shame. A man could hold a chest of gold and still starve beside it. Debtors groaned beneath the weight of promises etched into clay tablets, knowing no harvest could pay what hunger demanded. Gold, once crown of exchange, had become a chain, binding people to debts heavier than stone. Temples glimmered with offerings, bowls of silver, statues gilded with sheets of beaten gold, altars encrusted with gems. Yet the incense rising from them smelled like hypocrisy. People asked quietly, why do the gods demand metal when the people demand bread? Priests spoke of divine honor, but honor does not fill the stomach. The temples became mirrors of injustice, their glittering halls reflecting despair. Gold weighed more heavily there than faith itself. The king, too, mistook gold for salvation. He summoned artisans to craft new crowns, new goblets, new ornaments to dazzle envoys and reassure the court. He believed splendor would mask decline, that brilliance could outshine famine. But gold only amplified fragility. Each jewel became a reminder of hunger unmet, each crown a mockery of bellies hollow. The king lifted his treasures higher, and the people bowed lower, as not in awe but in resentment. Thus the law of gold whispered its lesson. Wealth, when hoarded, becomes curse. It does not protect, it corrodes. It does not unite, it divides. Babylon, weighed down by its treasures, discovered that what gleams brightest may also break most swiftly. For gold, unlike grain, cannot be eaten. Unlike water, cannot quench. Unlike trust, cannot endure. Gold began to corrode loyalty long before swords touched Babylon's walls. Soldiers, once proud to guard the gates, found their wages delayed, their rations thin. Into that silence stepped whispers. Persia pays well, Persia rewards loyalty with silver. Persia spares those who bend. A handful of coins, stamped with a foreign king's seal, carried more weight than decrees from the throne. Hunger had weakened bodies, but gold weakened hearts. Nobles turned to their own hoards, weighing survival against fidelity. Some hid treasures beneath courtyards, others smuggled jewels beyond the river, preparing for a future they would not defend. A few dared to bargain directly with Persian envoys, trading secrets of walls and gates for the promise of safety. Betrayal needed no sword, no open defiance, only the quiet passing of coins across a table, the clink of metal heavier than any oath. Temples, too, bent beneath the weight of gold. Priests assured the people that offerings still pleased the gods, but behind closed doors their storerooms grew crowded. Rumors swirled that priests measured their wealth by weight, not devotion, and that prayers rose more swiftly when accompanied by gold. The sacred became transaction. The people who once offered willingly began to curse under their breath, seeing their last coins vanish into altars while their children starved. Faith eroded beneath the gleam. Markets mirrored this fracture. Merchants clutched bags heavy with metal yet hollow with meaning. They saw that coins no longer bought bread, only envy, only danger. Robberies multiplied, not for sacks of grain but for jewels sewn into robes. Gold invited violence, summoned distrust, spread suspicion. In alleys men whispered that wealth was poison, yet none could let it go. The metal clung to them, as chains cling to prisoners. Even the king's court, once unified in spectacle, broke beneath gold's burden. Nobles quarreled over tributes, accusing each other of hoarding more than their share. Council dissolved into rivalry, rivalry into silence. The throne room glittered, but its brilliance masked decay. Every jewel set in the crown pressed like a stone upon the king's brow. Every golden goblet a reminder of famine outside his gates. He drank from them anyway, as if to deny their weight, but denial does not lessen heaviness. Gold had once been Babylon's pride, symbol of its splendor, proof of its divine favor. Now it became anchor, dragging the city downward as rivers shifted and enemies closed in. For gold is heavy, and those who cling to it sink. Babylon clung too tightly. The law of gold sharpened. Wealth that cannot feed becomes curse. Wealth that cannot unite becomes fracture. Wealth that cannot save becomes betrayal. Babylon had mistaken treasure for strength, but strength was never in metal. It was in trust, in grain, in rivers, in silence. Gold was only glitter, and glitter blinds. In the end, Babylon's treasures became its most dangerous enemy. Gold drew invaders as honey draws flies, gleaming louder than walls, louder than prayers, louder than fear. Persia did not need to invent reasons for conquest. Babylon's wealth provided them. Every crown, every goblet, every jewel whispered invitation. The city's glory meant to inspire awe, instead sharpened the hunger of its enemies. When the Persians diverted the river and entered by silence, they did not storm into battle. They walked into inheritance. Their torches lit corridors that gleamed with hoarded metal. In chambers where people starved, chests overflowed with gold sealed tight, guarded more fiercely than children. Soldiers opened them, and coins spilled across floors like rivers freed from dams. Gold had waited too long to be spent on life. Now it poured freely for death. Nobles who betrayed their king were rewarded, but their reward was curse. The Persians accepted their guidance, took their gold, then stripped them of power. Those who clutched treasure were the first to be looted, their jewels torn from fingers, their coffers carried into foreign hands. Gold, once shield, became target. Betrayal, once promise, became ruin. The weight of their hoards dragged them down faster than any spear. Temples fell silent under the invasion. The priests who had hoarded gold in the name of gods watched their sanctuaries stripped bare. Statues plated in beaten metal were pulled down, offerings seized. The gods had been bribed with gold for years, but in the end gold proved faithless. No divine hand defended altars. The people watching silently did not resist. Their faith had long dissolved into resentment. The king, too, faced judgment by weight. His crown glittered as he knelt, jewels catching the last torchlight of a fallen throne. But crowns are heavy, and heavier still when no one believes in their shine. The Persians lifted it from his head, not with reverence but with ease, as one lifts a bauble from the dust. Gold's weight had broken him. It had promised permanence, but delivered surrender. Outside, the people searched rubble and ruins, gathering scraps of grain, bits of cloth, anything useful. They did not reach for gold. The streets glittered with scattered coins, yet few stooped to claim them. Hunger had taught them the truth. Gold cannot be eaten, cannot warm, cannot shield. Those who did clutch it found themselves targets of thieves and soldiers alike. Even in ruin, gold betrayed. Thus the law of gold delivered its final verdict. Wealth does not save empires, it unravels them. It invites envy, deepens betrayal, and corrupts loyalty. Babylon's splendor became its burden. Its treasures became its chains. Gold had been crown, but it was also curse, and curses do not break gently. When night fell upon the conquered city, fires glowed against walls once gilded in legend. Smoke rose, carrying with it the last illusions of eternal wealth. In silence, the Persians divided spoils. In silence, the people searched for food. And above, the stars remained indifferent, their cold light unbroken by treasure. Babylon's gold had weighed too heavily, and under its weight, the empire sank. The law of gold closed its lesson. What gleams brightest breaks fastest. Babylon mistook wealth for eternity, but eternity belongs only to time. Gold glittered, but glitter is fragile. The city that worshipped metal was buried by it, leaving behind only echoes, ruins, and coins scattered like dust across the ages. Night lay heavy upon Babylon, though torches blazed in every courtyard. The city's rulers declared a festival, a celebration meant to mask unease. Music spilled from palaces, drums and lyres weaving a rhythm that tried to drown the silence creeping at the edges. Servants poured wine into golden goblets. Dancers spun with jeweled veils. Nobles laughed louder than their hearts allowed. The city feasted as if abundance could outpace fate. Yet shadows lengthened between every flame. The walls still towered, gates still closed, and the river still wound beneath the city. But unease spread through the crowd like smoke. Whispers clung to the air. The Persians were near, the omens clear, the gods silent. Still, the festival roared. Babylon had always celebrated to silence fear, to bury dread beneath music. But fear does not die. It hides, waiting for silence to return. And silence always returns. In the great hall, torches painted lions on the plaster walls, their shapes flickering as if restless. The king reclined on a couch inlaid with ivory, his hand heavy with rings. He raised his goblet high, proclaiming the city's strength, proclaiming the walls eternal. His voice rang bold, but his eyes betrayed fatigue, his crown weighing like lead. Around him, nobles echoed his laughter, though each wondered in secret how long laughter could keep shadows away. The people outside the palace joined in their own way. Streets swelled with noise, children chasing torchlight, musicians plucking at worn strings, vendors selling what little remained. Smoke from roasting meat coiled upward, but the portions were thin, stretched to create the illusion of plenty. Families sang songs older than walls, their voices cracked but steady. They celebrated not from joy but from defiance. If ruin must come, let it find them singing. Yet the shadows deepened. Behind shuttered doors, some families did not join the festival. They sat in silence, guarding crumbs of bread, whispering of omens. They remembered the writing on the wall, the prophecies whispered by priests, the hunger that hollowed their children's eyes. They knew the music above was no shield, only curtain, and curtains tear. The law of shadows revealed its first truth. Empires do not always fall in daylight. Sometimes they fall at night, when laughter masks dread, when music hides silence, when shadows slip deeper than flame. Babylon's last festival had begun, brilliant, defiant, doomed. The music grew louder as the night deepened, as if volume could banish inevitability. Drums pounded like restless hearts, lyres shivered with trembling chords, flutes wailed thin and sharp. Dancers spun faster, their veils catching torchlight in dazzling arcs, each movement frantic, as though they too feared the silence waiting beyond. Laughter burst from noble throats, but it cracked too quickly, fading before it reached the walls. The festival was no longer celebration, it was denial made visible. Omens pierced the noise. A torch sputtered and died, though oil remained. A goblet slipped from a hand and shattered into a starburst of shards at the king's feet. A musician snapped a string mid-song, the note lashing the air like a whip. Each moment was small, but small moments gathered weight. Some looked toward the heavens, half expecting the stars to shift. Others stared at the walls, wondering if shadows beyond had already moved closer. The priests moved through the crowd with incense and chants, voices raised higher than music. They declared the gods were pleased, that Marduk watched over the city, that feasting itself was a shield. Yet their eyes betrayed unease, darting often toward the river where shadows thickened. Their chants sounded brittle, as though words themselves feared to stand too firmly. Faith at that hour felt less like devotion and more like pleading. In alleys, the festival rang differently. Drunken voices stumbled against stone walls. Children dozed in corners while their parents clutched empty bowls. Musicians strayed into silence when strings broke, leaving only drum beats echoing like distant footsteps. A beggar lifted his hands toward the palace lights and whispered a curse, too soft for anyone to hear, but curses travel further than songs. His shadow stretched long upon the earth, longer than his body, a reminder that darkness always claims more space than light. Inside the palace, shadows multiplied. Curtains stirred though no wind touched them. Goblets trembled in unsteady hands, and servants exchanged uneasy glances as they passed dishes lighter than ever before. The king drank deeply, his laughter ringing hollow, each echo swallowed quickly by silence. He leaned on wealth, on glitter, on ritual, believing that if he dazzled long enough, dawn would find him still enthroned. Yet even the crown on his head seemed dimmer that night, its jewels absorbing light instead of scattering it. The people outside tried to dance harder, sing louder, drink deeper, but excess revealed its cracks. A woman fainted in the street, hunger unmasked by wine. A child clutched his mother's robe and asked why shadows moved faster than torches. A man stared long at the sky and swore he saw smoke rising beyond the horizon, though no fires burned. The festival roared, but dread threaded through every laugh, every song, every step. The law of shadows pressed its lesson. Fear can be hidden beneath light, but never destroyed. Music cannot drown prophecy, nor can wine wash away hunger, nor can gold silence omens. Babylon danced as though shadows were harmless, yet shadows lengthen most when light burns brightest. And that night the torches blazed higher than ever. The festival reached its height just as strength began to fail. Music roared in every court, wine spilled across stone floors, torches blazed in frantic procession. Yet beneath the brightness, silence pressed like a tide. Servants carried trays with shaking hands, nobles laughed too quickly, priests chanted with voices edged by fear. The noise was desperate, not joyous, a city singing against its own ending. Then the shadows breached the edges of sound. Along the river, the current had thinned to a whisper, diverted into waiting channels carved by Persian hands. What once shimmered as Babylon's lifeblood now revealed mud, damp and exposed. Boots pressed into it softly, leaving no cry, no clash, only the muffled rhythm of inevitability. Soldiers slid into the city through the river gates left unwatched. Their torches doused, their armor darkened. The fall began not with roar, but with quiet footsteps. Inside the palace, a moment fractured the illusion. A torch sputtered, showering sparks against the painted lions on the wall. For a heartbeat, the lions seemed alive, their jaws open in silent roar. The dancers froze, the musicians faltered, and into that pause drifted unease too deep to deny. The king raised his cup to fill the gap, forcing laughter, but the spell was broken. Shadows had entered the room, though no soldier yet appeared. Whispers spread among the crowd. Some claimed to hear movement beyond the walls, others swore they felt the floor tremble faintly. Fear moved faster than truth. The music resumed, but weaker, stripped of its power. Dancers spun, but their veils dragged heavy with dread. The festival thinned into fragments, each song more fragile than the last. In the streets, the people sensed it too. A dog howled at nothing. A gate creaked. Though no wind stirred, a sudden chill swept alleys crowded with revelers. Families withdrew to doorways, pulling children close, extinguishing lamps one by one. The festival shrank into the palace, while the rest of the city fell into uneasy stillness. It was as if Babylon itself had decided to stop pretending. The Persians advanced deeper, their silence heavier than any shout. They met little resistance. Soldiers were weary, nobles distracted, priests absorbed in ritual. Step by step, shadow replaced torchlight. The law of shadows fulfilled itself. Conquest unfolded not in battle, but in silence veiled by noise, inevitability hidden beneath denial. By dawn, the music had died. Torches smoldered in pools of wine, the feast abandoned, the palace hushed. The city, once radiant with celebration, awoke in conquest's grip. No trumpet had sounded, no thunder had broken, only shadows had passed through doors left open by arrogance. Babylon, jewel of rivers, had ended in a festival of denial. Thus the law of shadows closed. The night before the fall is not silence alone, but noise that hides silence. Shadows move where light blinds, and empires collapse not in the hour they expect, but in the hour they deny. Babylon feasted, and beneath its feast, the darkness entered. Ash does not fall all at once. It drifts slowly like snow settling on stone, on cloth, on hair, on memory. In the first hours after Babylon's surrender, smoke rose in curling threads from temples and palaces alike. Fires, some sparked by invaders, others by desperate hands, licked the painted walls and climbed cedar beams. The air grew heavy with the scent of burning oil, incense, and cedar resin. Gold did not burn, but it blackened, dulled, lost its shine. The city once called eternal now glowed in ruin, its crown dissolving grain by grain into ash. The throne room, once the heart of splendor, became a chamber of silence. The king's seat stood empty, its cushions torn, its inlays cracked by heat. Jewels, once polished daily, lay scattered across the floor, trampled under boots. Soldiers moved through the hall without reverence, their torches leaving streaks of soot across painted lions. The throne itself seemed smaller now, stripped of the illusion of permanence, a chair of wood and gold, fragile against the weight of fire and time. Priests attempted to save statues of gods, hauling them through smoke-filled courts. Some staggered beneath golden effigies, their robes catching embers, their voices hoarse with chants. But idols fell, striking the ground with hollow thuds. To the people watching, it was as though the gods themselves had abandoned their pedestals. Faith cracked like plaster beneath flame, and the silence that followed was heavier than smoke. In the streets, ashes rained on markets that once overflowed with life. Stalls collapsed into smoldering heaps, spices reduced to bitter smoke, cloth curling into black ribbons. A child picked up a fragment of tile from the ground, blue once, now dulled to grey, and turned it in his hand as if trying to remember the colour of eternity. Around him, men and women sifted silently through rubble, searching not for wealth but for bread, for water, for something unburned. The river itself reflected fire. Where once it shimmered silver in torchlight, now it carried black streaks, floating fragments of charred wood and broken vessels. The Euphrates, Babylon's lifeline, became its mirror of ruin. It carried away ash just as it once carried treasure, indifferent to both. Those who stood on its banks watched the current drag away fragments of their world and understood that no river can hold back fire. The law of ashes declared its opening truth. Crowns do not shatter in thunder, they dissolve in smoke. Fire does not ask permission, it writes its own scripture upon walls. Babylon's splendor, its wealth, its gods, its throne, all faded into grey dust that clung to every breath. What the city believed eternal revealed itself as fragile, perishable, fleeting. Ash settled where pride once stood, and in that settling, the empire dissolved. Ash crept into every crevice of the city, a patient invader more enduring than armies. It coated statues in temples, dimming their eyes of gold. It clung to the robes of priests who no longer chanted, but coughed in silence. Incense, once thick with fragrance, now mingled with smoke, acrid and bitter. Worshippers who had crowded the courtyards only days before stood scattered, their heads bowed not in reverence, but in despair. They watched flames consume cedar doors, mosaics crumble into dust, prayers vanish into choking air. In the great ziggurat, once a ladder of brick toward heaven, fire licked upward step by step. The tower stood stubborn in silhouette, but smoke poured from its tiers, blackening the stars above. Priests tried to save sacred scrolls, carrying bundles of clay tablets into the streets, but many slipped and shattered, their inscriptions breaking like brittle bones. Knowledge itself dissolved into fragments, half-words, broken lines. The loss was not just of stone and wood, but of memory. Stories erased into ash. Families fled through alleyways, clutching what little remained. Some carried jars of water, others scraps of bread. A few held nothing but children wrapped in smoke-stained cloth. They moved like shadows, their faces streaked with ash, their silence louder than screams. Doors swung open and closed as if the city itself exhaled, sighing out its last breath. Those who lingered gathered near the river, watching embers drift across the current. The Euphrates carried the city's ruins as it had once carried its wealth, indifferent to both. Markets that had once roared with bargaining stood as hollow skeletons. Canopies burned away, leaving charred frames that pointed toward a sky veiled in smoke. Scorched grain littered the streets like blackened sand. A merchant, once proud of his silver scales, crouched in the soot with empty hands, his eyes fixed on nothing. Gold and silver glittered still, scattered on the ground, but no one reached for them. Hunger had made metal meaningless. Survival weighed heavier than coins. The palace itself grew quiet. Soldiers moved through its halls, their boots stirring layers of ash. Tapestries collapsed in flames, ceilings groaned under weight of smoke, columns cracked with heat. The king no longer sat upon his throne. Some whispered he had fled, others that he had been seized. But in truth, it did not matter. The crown had dissolved before the man who wore it. Authority, once solid as stone, drifted now like dust in the wind, weightless, ownerless. Children played with fragments of pottery amid ruins, too young to grasp what had ended. They traced patterns in soot, their laughter thin but stubborn. Elders watching them shook their heads in silence. For the old knew what ash meant, the end of memory, the dissolution of pride. Where children saw toys, elders saw epitaphs. Babylon, city of walls and wonders, had become playground of dust. The law of ashes pressed deeper. Fire does not destroy only matter. It unmakes meaning. Thrones become chairs, temples become rubble, crowns become trinkets, stories become fragments. Ash covers equally, king and beggar, priest and thief, palace and hut. It settles without judgment, and in that indifference lies its power. Babylon had believed in eternity. Ash revealed eternity belonged to time alone. At last the fires dimmed, leaving the city cloaked in grey. The wind stirred, lifting ash into spirals that drifted across streets once alive with song. Babylon stood hollow, its walls still tall, but its heart emptied. Silence hung over the avenues where markets once thundered, where festivals once glittered. Only the sound of crumbling brick and the soft hiss of embers marked the passing of empire. The crown itself, symbol of Babylon's might, lay abandoned. Once polished until it gleamed like sunrise, it now lay dulled, soot clinging to its edges. Soldiers carried it, but without reverence. To them it was no longer sacred, only a spoil among spoils, heavy but stripped of meaning. In the eyes of the people, the crown dissolved before their gaze, becoming nothing more than a circle of metal, weighty only in memory. Ash settled in the temples, coating the faces of gods that had once seemed eternal. Statues stared outward with blind eyes, their features smudged, their gold blackened. Worshippers approached hesitantly, not with offerings, but with silence. For if the gods had permitted this ruin, what prayers could matter now? Faith itself was smothered beneath layers of grey. Some wept, others turned away. The temples no longer promised eternity, they promised only dust. In alleyways, families sifted through rubble, their hands blackened, their faces streaked. They searched not for treasures, but for fragments of life, an unbroken jar, a loaf spared by chance, a blanket still whole. Children gathered shards of colored tiles, turning them in their hands like jewels of another age. They asked their parents what the pictures had once shown. The parents could not answer. The stories, like the tiles, were shattered, their meaning lost in ash. The Euphrates, constant and indifferent, carried ashes downstream. Flames reflected upon its surface like fractured suns, but the water did not slow. It bore away fragments of cedar beams, scraps of parchment, blackened grain. The river that had once given life now became undertaker, bearing Babylon's remains toward the horizon. Those who stood at its banks knew they were watching not just fire, but history being carried into silence. At night, the stars burned bright above the haze. They had watched Akkad fade, had watched Assyria collapse, and now they watched Babylon dissolve into embers. To the stars, this was no tragedy, only repetition. Crowns rise, crowns fall, ash replaces gold, silence replaces song. The people who gazed upward felt both comfort and despair. Comfort that the sky endured, despair that their city did not. And yet, even in ruin, something endured. In whispers, survivors began to tell stories of walls that had touched the heavens, of markets alive with every tongue, of rivers that once carried the wealth of nations. They spoke not to preserve pride, but to preserve memory. For ash erases, but words resist. Babylon dissolved in fire, but lived in voice, in tale, in prophecy. The law of ashes had taken crown and temple, but memory slipped through its fingers. Thus, the law of ashes closed its lesson. Empires do not end in thunder, but in grey silence. Crowns dissolve, temples burn, walls blacken. Ash is the final equalizer, settling on kings and beggars alike, erasing splendor and shame together. Yet from ash rises memory, fragile but enduring, carried by wind, by river, by story. Babylon's crown dissolved into dust, but its name endured, whispered across centuries, glowing faintly like embers in the dark. Ruins are never only ruins, they are mirrors. When travelers came upon Babylon's shattered gates, when they walked the blackened avenues and traced their hands along fallen stone, they did not see only the city's end. They saw reflections of their own kingdoms, their own pride, their own fragility. Babylon was no longer Babylon alone. It became symbol, a looking glass in which every empire glimpsed its fate. The Persians, who inherited the city, saw themselves reflected in its ashes. They marveled at Babylon's walls and temples, yet knew in silence that their own grandeur would someday dim. Cyrus walked its streets not only as conqueror, but as witness. He saw how wealth had turned to burden, how faith had been silenced, how betrayal had hollowed a crown. Babylon warned even its victors, for every triumph in conquest is also a prophecy of decline. Centuries later, Rome gazed into Babylon's mirror. Its senators spoke of roads stretching farther than rivers, of markets swelling with grain and wine, of legions that guarded horizons as wide as the world. Yet poets whispered of Babylon's fall, reminding Rome that walls cannot guard against time, that hunger and excess crack foundations more surely than siege. Roman triumphs glittered, but Babylon's shadow walked beside them. Each triumphal arch was a mirror, reflecting not only victory, but inevitable collapse. Byzantium, too, felt the echo. Its domes rose above waters, its mosaics shimmered in light, its markets echoed with gold and silk. Yet whispers of Babylon reached its streets, carried by monks and chroniclers. They told of rivers diverted, of kings betrayed, of crowns dissolving into ash. Byzantium understood, though it did not admit, that mirrors do not flatter. Babylon's image hung like smoke over its splendor, a reminder that even empires of faith and trade must bow to time. The law of mirrors opened with this truth: ruins are warnings disguised as reflections. To see Babylon was to see oneself, not in present glory, but in future silence. Every empire that gazed into its dust found the same image: walls crumbling, markets emptying, crowns dissolving. For Babylon was not merely past, it was prophecy carried forward. The mirror did not fade with antiquity. It lingered, gleaming faintly in every hall of power, in every marketplace where silver clinked, in every throne room where pride outweighed humility. Babylon's shadow stretched across centuries, subtle, yet unshakable. Kings crowned in distant lands heard their names compared to its rulers, some with reverence, others with warning. To be likened to Babylon was to be great and to be doomed. Medieval kingdoms gazed into the mirror and trembled. Castles rose from hillsides, their stones stacked high as if walls could halt time. Markets swelled within them, peasants toiled beyond them, priests whispered of eternal order beneath stained glass light. Yet sermons told of Babylon, of pride punished, of towers brought low. Every cathedral spire reaching for heaven carried a shadow of that earlier city whose ambition had once scraped the sky. The lesson lingered. To rise too high is to invite the fall. The age of sails brought the mirror across oceans. Colonial empires declared their dominion, carving maps with ink and blood, carrying gold, silver and spices as if to rebuild Babylon upon distant shores. But the mirror waited. Ships that returned heavy with treasure often returned also with debt, with famine, with whispers of rebellion. In London, in Seville, in Amsterdam, Babylon's reflection shimmered, markets overflowing while hunger simmered, temples built upon bones, crowns glittering while people trembled. The cycle repeated as it always does. In every age the mirror showed two faces, splendor and fragility. It reflected abundance in markets and betrayal in palaces. It reflected festivals and the silence that follows them. Rulers preferred the first image, the one of greatness, but the second image lingered, sharper and truer. For Babylon's lesson was not that empires should not rise, but that they should not forget they are mortal. Even now, in the hum of modern cities, the mirror remains. Towers of glass rise higher than ziggurats. Markets span continents through unseen currents of trade. Wealth circulates like rivers once did, and yet the mirror whispers. It shows shelves emptied in times of famine, voices of dissent silenced by pride, alliances fractured by greed. It reminds us that no system, however vast, is immune. Babylon's fate flickers in the circuits of commerce, in the smoke of wars, in the silence of betrayal. The law of mirrors deepened its lesson. To look into ruins is to see one's own reflection, waiting. No empire is exempt, no city is beyond the reach of silence. Babylon's ash became prophecy, and every age that followed has glimpsed itself within it, sometimes with awe, sometimes with dread. In the final reflection, the mirror turns fully upon the present. Babylon's dust is not only history, it is prophecy that speaks into the pulse of modern cities. Skyscrapers stretch toward the heavens as ziggurats once did, their windows glowing like captured stars. Markets hum across continents, invisible rivers carrying grain, oil, silver, data. Wealth gathers in towers, while hunger lingers in alleys. The mirror waits, patient, showing us not what we boast but what we risk. Babylon whispers into crowded streets of New York, London, Beijing, Delhi. It reminds us that trade is fragile, that wealth is tied, that hunger moves quicker than armies. It warns that walls, whether of stone or law or algorithm, cannot hold forever. Every empire believes it has learned from the past, yet the mirror offers no comfort. Lessons ignored are lessons repeated, and the dust of Babylon clings even to glass and steel. In times of feast, the reflection is brightest. Concert halls fill, lights dazzle, markets overflow with goods shipped from horizons unseen. Yet listen closely. Silence presses at the edges, as it once pressed against Babylon's feasts. Excess blinds vigilance. Abundance becomes burden. The law of excess returns, wearing modern garments. We eat, we sing, we build, and the mirror shows us eating, singing, building, then falling. In times of famine, the reflection grows sharper still. Empty shelves echo the same truth as empty granaries. Grain once weighed heavier than gold. Today it is oil, water, or the currents of invisible trade. When supply falters, cities tremble. When rivers dry, nations crack. When alliances fray, hunger sharpens its teeth. The law of hunger endures, and the mirror shows our own fragility more clearly than ever. Even crowns dissolve as they once did. Today they are not always golden circlets, but symbols of power. Flags, offices, currencies, laws. They gleam brightly, yet the mirror whispers that they too will fade, swallowed by ash or silence. Leaders rise declaring permanence. But Babylon waits in their reflection, reminding them that no permanence exists. Thrones, whether carved of cedar or written in code, rest always on sand. And yet, the mirror is not despair alone. It is also reminder. The story of Babylon lingers not because it ended, but because it was remembered. Ashes dissolve, but memory endures. To see one's reflection in Babylon is to be warned, yes, but also to be humbled. The mirror teaches that survival lies not in denial, but in listening. To omens, to silence, to the fragility of abundance. Empires fall when they refuse the mirror. They endure in spirit when they heed it. Thus, the law of mirrors closes its lesson. Babylon lives on in every city, in every empire, in every system that believes itself eternal. Its ruins reflect forward, showing us not only what was, but what will be if pride blinds us to fragility. To walk among Babylon's echoes is to see oneself, and in that reflection lies both prophecy and choice, to repeat or to remember. Time is not river alone. Time is not flame alone. Time is ocean, vast, patient, without shore. It laps against every wall, every crown, every market, every temple. Empires rise like waves cresting in sunlight, dazzling, triumphant. Empires fall like waves collapsing into foam, their roar fading into silence. Babylon learned this truth, and in its dust, every throne must learn again. The ocean of time consumes all. The illusion of permanence was Babylon's first crown. Its walls glittered like mountains. Its gates roared with lions. Its markets overflowed. The people believed stone eternal, but stone is sand when measured against stars. The ocean licked their walls with centuries, and the walls fell. Illusion dissolved into silence. Time does not need armies, it waits. The rivers sustained Babylon, feeding fields, filling markets, stitching the city to the world. Yet rivers are tributaries of time, carrying not only grain but fate. When waters faltered, so too did the city. When Cyrus bent the river, time bent with him. The ocean consumed Babylon not in storm, but in currents. Exchange made Babylon's heart beat. Markets throbbed with silver, spices, contracts pressed into clay. But the law of exchange is also the law of debt. What is promised must be paid, and time demands the final payment. When greed swelled, when betrayal poisoned trade, the ocean was already near. Silver clinked, contracts endured, but time wrote heavier records. Excess drowned Babylon as surely as drought. Feasts roared, temples demanded more, pride swelled louder than prayer. But abundance too is fragile. Too much becomes burden, too heavy for thrones to bear. Time weighed their feasts, their palaces, their boasts, and found them wanting. The ocean swelled, patient, until abundance sank. Fear hollowed the city before spears touched its gates. Rumors became prophecy, shadows became enemies. Betrayal followed, nobles trading loyalty for gold, priests twisting omens, soldiers selling silence. The walls still stood, but time had already breached them, flowing inward through cracks of trust. Fear and betrayal were waves, their crest breaking long before dawn. Thus begins the final law. The ocean of time consumes all thrones, not in rage, but in rhythm. Babylon was only one shore upon which the tide withdrew, leaving ruins like shells. Rome, Byzantium, empires of stone and steel, all are only temporary islands. The tide is already rising. Time gathers every law into its tide. What Babylon learned in fragments, through walls, rivers, markets, feasts, betrayals, the ocean of time gathers whole. Each principle is not separate but a wave, rolling toward one inevitable shore. Illusion, hunger, silence, gold, ashes, all are currents flowing into one sea. Silence was Babylon's true conqueror. Armies entered by stealth, but the city had already surrendered in quiet. Time thrives in silence, for silence is the sound of crowns dissolving. The festival of shadows, the unspoken dread in markets, the unanswered prayers in temples, all were rehearsals for silence. And once silence ruled, time claimed its throne. Prophecy gave the silence words. The writing on the wall glowed for a moment, then vanished, yet it was enough. Time does not need lengthy speeches. A single phrase is sufficient to weigh a city against eternity. You are measured. You are found wanting. Prophecy was not foretelling, but remembering. Time had always known the measure of Babylon. Hunger pressed the city inward, grinding its pride to powder. Fields lay beyond reach, granaries hollowed, mothers quieted children with empty hands. Hunger is time's sharpest tool, stripping illusions of wealth and power, reducing crowns to crumbs. When Babylon starved, it was not Cyrus who conquered. It was time gnawing through flesh into memory. Gold became anchor, dragging Babylon down into depths. It glittered in temples, in palaces, in markets, but its weight was curse. Men betrayed for it. Gods were mocked with it. Enemies hungered after it. Yet when ash settled, gold lay scattered, ignored, meaningless. Time corrodes gold not by rust, but by irrelevance. In silence, the heaviest treasure is light as dust. Shadows played their part. The last festival, the frantic music, the dancers spinning against dread. Shadows stretched across the feast until they swallowed it whole. Shadows are the shapes time takes when it enters unnoticed. They blur the line between denial and doom. Babylon's final night was not storm but shadow, proof that the ocean does not always roar. Sometimes it steals in with quiet surf. Then ashes. The city dissolved into smoke and dust, its crown dulled, its temples blackened. Ash is the handwriting of time upon earth. It marks where flames have spoken, where pride has ended, where memory has begun. Babylon became ash, and ash became prophecy, scattered into every age that followed. The mirror completes the circle. Every empire that gazed upon Babylon's ruins saw itself. Rome in its marble, Byzantium in its domes, modern towers of glass and steel, all are only reflections in the mirror of time. Babylon did not die alone. It lives in every empire that dares call itself eternal. For time's ocean reflects endlessly, and the reflection is always the same. The final law gathers them: silence, prophecy, hunger, gold, shadows, ashes, mirrors. All are not separate judgments, but waves of one tide. The ocean of time consumes, not in rage, not in haste, but in rhythm eternal. Babylon's fall was not exception. It was law. The ocean of time has no shore, yet it leaves behind fragments. What is broken becomes memory. What is dissolved becomes story. Babylon's gates, once dazzling, are dust, but their image lingers in scripture and legend. Its markets are gone, but the echo of their noise hums in every modern city. Its crown has melted into ash, but the symbol of its fall glows in prophecy still recited. Time consumes thrones, but it also scatters embers, and embers drift farther than fire. In this ocean, no empire is spared. The tide that took Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia will rise for Rome, Byzantium, the caliphates, the kingdoms of Europe, the colonies of the New World. It rises still for towers of glass, for circuits of commerce, for nations that call themselves eternal. The mirror of Babylon is always present. The tide is always near. To forget is to repeat. To remember is to endure, not forever, but more wisely. And yet there is no malice in time. The ocean does not rage, it simply moves. Waves erode cliffs, but they also shape them. Time dissolves crowns, but it also carves memory. The silence that buried Babylon also preserved it, turning dust into lesson, ruin into scripture. The ocean takes, but it also leaves behind the reflection we call history, not as comfort, but as compass. The stars bear witness to this ocean. They glitter above ruins, just as they once glittered above palaces. They outlast walls, crowns, and even memory, shining indifferent, eternal. To look upon them is to feel the smallness of empires, and yet also their belonging, for even the greatest crown is but a reflection of starlight, brief and bright, before dissolving into dark. The stars remind us that the ocean is not only devouring, it is also continuity. So the final law speaks: the ocean of time consumes all thrones. What is built must fall. What is gathered must scatter. What is crowned must be unthroned. Babylon was not exception. It was example. Its silence became prophecy, its ash became scripture, its fall became mirror. In its end, every empire sees its beginning, and in its beginning, every empire sees its end. Thus, the tale closes, not with thunder, but with tide. Babylon dissolves, and yet it endures in story. The ocean swallows, and yet it leaves memory glowing like embers on the water. Thrones sink, crowns dissolve, empires fade. But the lesson drifts onward, gentle and merciless. Nothing is eternal but time itself. The story began with walls that reached for the sky, with gates painted in blue and gold, with markets that pulsed like rivers, with festivals that believed themselves eternal. The story ends with silence, with ash, with echoes scattered like embers on the tide. Babylon's fall is not a tale of one city, but of all cities. It is the reminder that what is built will unbuild, what is crowned will uncrown, and what is sung will one day fade into whisper. The ocean of time waits for every throne. The law of illusion was the first to break. Babylon believed its walls would outlast stars. Yet stone, no matter how strong, crumbles beneath centuries. Stars remained patient and unblinking, while the towers of kings turned to dust. The lesson lingered. What seems permanent is only fragile shadow. The law of rivers followed, whispering in silver currents. The Euphrates gave abundance, but abundance is never loyalty. It carried grain and treasure into the heart of Babylon, then carried silence out again. When the Persians bent the river, they bent the city's fate. Rivers give, rivers take, and empires cannot hold their flow. The law of exchange taught that markets are thrones. In stalls heavy with spice, in coins pressed with royal seals, Babylon built its power. But trade is fragile, and greed corrodes faster than stone. Markets divided the city as much as they enriched it. Exchange became chain, and the throne of silver cracked. The law of excess weighed heavily. Feasts roared while hunger whispered outside the palace doors. Abundance blinded, dulled vigilance, widened fractures. What is too full cannot last. What is too loud cannot endure. Babylon's splendor became burden, and burden became ruin. The law of fear entered as rumor, soft-footed and relentless. Whispers of Persia became prophecy. Fear hollowed the city long before soldiers entered. No army need attack a city that has already surrendered in dread. Fear is the shadow that conquers first. The law of betrayal soon followed. Nobles bartered loyalty, priests twisted omens, soldiers weighed wages against honor. Babylon fell not by foreign hand, but by its own cracks. Thrones stand upon trust, and trust is sand. Once it slips, crowns sink. The law of silence wrote its truth in the final night. No clash of arms thundered, no horns warned. The Persians entered as shadows, and Babylon surrendered in stillness. Silence is the heaviest sound. The law of memory began even as fires smoldered. The ruins became scripture, the fall became prophecy. Babylon lived on not in stone, but in story. Memory outlasts walls, whispers endure when crowns dissolve. The law of prophecy gave memory a voice. The writing on the wall glowed for an instant, declaring the city measured and found wanting. Those words have echoed through centuries, carved into every empire's imagination. Prophecy is not prediction, it is mirror. It shows us the end already seeded in the beginning. The law of hunger gnawed deepest. No wall could hold against empty granaries. No crown could silence the stomach's cry. Hunger broke Babylon more surely than armies, teaching that bread is throne, bread is crown, bread is empire. The law of gold weighed heavier still. Treasures glittered in temples, jewels shone on crowns, but they became chains. Gold divided, corrupted, betrayed. It drew invaders, fractured loyalty, mocked hunger. In the end, the people reached not for coins, but for crumbs. The law of shadows wrapped the cities last night. Music played, dancers spun, torches blazed, but dread thickened between the flames. Shadows lengthened until they became gates. Babylon feasted while silence entered. Denial is a fragile shield. The law of ashes sealed the story. Fires licked towers and temples, reducing crowns to soot, markets to dust, prayers to smoke. Ash settled without judgment, covering king and beggar alike. Babylon dissolved into grey, leaving silence where splendor had stood. The law of mirrors reflected forward. Rome, Byzantium, the kingdoms of Europe, the empires of modern trade, all saw themselves in Babylon's dust. To gaze upon ruins is to see oneself waiting. Babylon is not past, it is prophecy. And the final law drew them all into one tide. The ocean of time consumes all thrones. Empires rise like waves, brilliant and brief, and fall back into silence. Only memory drifts onward, fragile but enduring, like foam on the water. So the story closes where it began. Walls beneath stars, pride beneath silence, crowns beneath time. Babylon has fallen, but its fall is lesson, not lament. To listen is to remember. To remember is to be humbled. To be humbled is to live gently within time's tide. Sleep now with Babylon's ruins in your mind. Hear the silence of its streets, the hush of its markets, the whisper of its river. Imagine the ashes settling soft, the stars still watching above. The crown has dissolved, the throne has vanished, but the lesson drifts eternal. Nothing is eternal but time. The ocean waits, the stars endure, and in their rhythm, empires rise, empires fall, and stories remain, lulling us into dreams.